Remnant Ambush, Trebium Wars, Book 2, by Matt Edsand. Narrated by Matt Edsand. Chapter 1. Outside Perimeter, Aurora. Sergeant Thompson navigated the patrol pod down the road. He had memorized this route to the extent that he could have driven it blindfolded. Seated beside him was Sergeant Milton. Both of them had been randomly chosen for today's duty. It was supposed to be a fair and random allocation of patrol routes, but Thompson doubted it. Thompson was fortunate to have Milton with him during today's patrol, as he had often interacted with him at their base. The cityscape of Aurora loomed on the right side as their vehicle moved along at a brisk pace. "Have you heard?" Milton asked. Thompson briefly looked in his direction. "Heard what?" "General Myers has retired," Milton said, as he flipped through his device. "I guess it was about time. The war hero has served everyone for so long." "Did they say who might be taking over his position?" Thompson asked. There weren't many people left to take over General Myers' position. The Euphra Defense Forces had only 2 colonels with the capability to take over General Myers' role. However, Thompson doubted either of them would be able to successfully fill the shoes of a legend. Following in the footsteps of General Myers would be a daunting challenge, and whoever took it on was doomed to a challenging life. Milton shook his head. "No, my bet is on Colonel Williams." Thompson laughed. "Are you in a betting mood again? I thought you stopped all such talk." "I was." Milton's voice trailed off. Thompson interrupted him as he peered at the device on his patrol pod. "What is that?" "What's going on?" Milton asked. "I'm getting a faint energy reading from up ahead," Thompson announced as he shared his device with Milton. "I thought you've done this patrol route 1,000,000 times, Milton said. Thompson frowned. "What are you implying?" "I didn't mean it like that," Milton remarked. "Maybe the device is malfunctioning." Thompson brought the patrol pod to a halt and examined the device. "No, the device seems to be working fine. Let me call it into command center." "We should check it out first," Milton insisted. "If it's a false positive, then we would be wasting a lot of people's time." Ever since the appearance of the Rukpli alien species in space 3 months ago, the Euphra Defense Forces had been on high alert. However, over the last 3 months, no new aliens had appeared. Initially, Thompson had been excited about fighting some aliens. The routine patrols and training exercises over the years had begun to bore him. Despite that, he knew the chances of running into aliens out here in Aurora were minimal. Aurora wasn't the capital city. It was a smaller city situated several hundred miles away from Arcadia. "I wish we could be transferred out to Arcadia," Milton said. Thompson smiled. Both of them had enough of being in Aurora. There was nothing of significance in this city. It had been one of many cities that had sprouted up in response to the overcrowding in Arcadia. It really was a boring place to live in. Thompson started up the patrol pod's engines. "Okay, let's take a look first." Milton raised his fist. "Finally, we have something to investigate." Thompson ignored Milton's excitement. The patrol pod continued moving forward until they came to a small hill. Thompson switched off the engine and stepped out of the pod. "The energy reading is coming from around here." Milton joined him. "It's just a hill. I think the device is broken." Thompson didn't want to give up so easily. "Let's take a short look around before continuing on our patrol." He began to walk towards the right side of the hill with his device in front of him. There was a slight increase in the energy reading levels. "I think it's coming from this side of the hill." Milton was a step behind him, still reading on his own device. As they rounded a corner, a cave appeared. Thompson stopped. "I think it's coming from inside there." Milton put away his device and pulled out his weapon. "Maybe we should first inform Central Command." Thompson ignored him as he walked towards the cave entrance. He pulled out his weapon and leveled it in front of him as he stepped into the cave. He heard the shuffling of feet behind him and guessed it was Milton. As they went deeper into the cave, Thompson noticed lights on the side. Someone was using this cave. He was about to turn around and head back out, but a glimmer caught his attention. He peered ahead. There was a cluster of tables and workstations several meters ahead of them. Chapter 2. Science Division 1, Arcadia. John Humphreys, Chief Scientist at Science Division 1, looked at the holographic projection in front of him. A single cell from the black liquid of the dead Rukpli stared back at him. Humphreys touched his chin as he examined the cell. There was nothing impressive about the alien cell structure. It looked like any other cell to him. He didn't know what he needed to look out for. It was the first time in his life that he was examining an alien cell. Chief Medical Officer Finn from the UFS Intrepid had sent him over the samples for further study a few days ago. He opened the holoscreen to Finn. It took a few seconds before Finn's face appeared. "John, it's good to talk to you again," Finn said. "Finn, let's get down to business," John scoffed. "I'm certain you must be busy up there in orbit." Finn laughed. "Busy is an understatement when you are in space, facing an unknown threat every day." Humphreys swiped the holographic projection onto the holoscreen. "I don't see anything unusual in this Rukpli cell. Have you tried inserting a human cell alongside it?" Finn asked. Humphreys smiled. "That was going to be my next step. You're just in time to witness it." He stepped away from the holoscreen to get a sample from the next stable. So when are you heading back to the surface? The captain hasn't specified a timeline for us yet, Finn replied. The admiral has requested we continue to orbit Euphra and keep scanning for any signs of the enemy ship. It's been 3 months already. Yes, but that doesn't mean a thing when we have an alien species ready to attack our planet, Finn said. They could return to this part of space at any moment. That's what happened in the initial attack. We weren't ready for an enemy. Have they got other vessels ready to join you all? Humphreys asked as he picked up a vial and brought it over to the one containing the Rukpli cell. I have heard that a few more destroyers are about to be commissioned, Finn remarked. The problem is that they are going to be helmed by junior officers sitting in the captain's seat. No better way than to learn in the fire, John said. Finn laughed. Okay, I'm about to insert a human cell into it, Humphreys commented as he returned to the holoscreen. Oh my goodness, Finn shouted. Humphreys swallowed hard. He couldn't believe what he was seeing in front of his eyes. The Rukpli cell had a sudden reaction to the presence of the human cell. In what could be considered a predatory action, the Rukpli cell extended itself and latched onto the human counterpart. Chapter 3. Outside perimeter, Aurora. Sergeant Thompson approached a cluster of tables. What's this place? Milton paused at one of the workstations. These look like alien symbols. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The moment Milton said it, Thompson pressed a button on his device. There was no need to wait any further for confirmation. He needed to report this in. The Euphra Defense Forces had a system by which he could raise a potential alert with the press of a button. The alert would go back to Central Command in Aurora, after which the officers there would decide on the next course of action. I called it in, Thompson admitted, as he took a seat at one of the workstations. These don't seem to be working yet. Maybe this place was a relic of the past, Milton remarked. Thompson narrowed his eyes. That doesn't still explain the energy reading that we got. Why did I get it now and not a few days ago or even last week? I'm pretty sure I did this route a few days ago. Milton shrugged as he also took a seat in front of another workstation. And I don't think this place is inactive, Thompson said as he pointed to the lights on the side. Someone has been using this place. I think we should leave the cave until we get some more people in here to secure this location. Milton nodded and his right hand accidentally fell on the workstation controls. Don't touch anything, Thompson warned. However, it was too late. Milton's right hand must have touched one of the controls. There were a series of beeps and the workstation in front of Milton began to hum. Thompson glared at Milton. What did you just do? I didn't mean to, Milton began. Thompson interrupted him and raised his right hand. Did you hear that? Milton glanced in his direction. Hear what? I think it's just the hum of the workstation. I'm surprised this machine is still able to start up after being in this cave for so long. Thompson was annoyed with Milton. He was being too lazy and complacent. This cave facility was being used by someone. Then, from the corner of his right eye, he caught a movement. He swirled around with his weapon in front of him. Milton looked amused. There's no one here. Thompson stood up and pointed his weapon ahead of him. I saw something. Before Milton could say another word, a figure emerged from behind Milton and leaped into his body. Milton's eyes closed and then opened again. Thompson took a few steps back in stunned silence. What's going on here? He couldn't have imagined what he had just witnessed. Milton's face contorted to reveal an alien's face. Are you going to shoot me? Thompson kept his weapon pointed at Milton. Whatever you are, get out of him. Thompson realized it had been a mistake to walk into this cave without reinforcements. This cave was being used by aliens. They seemed like the same Rukpli aliens he had heard about. As you wish, Milton sneered, and the alien left his body and Milton's body disintegrated. Thompson was about to turn and run, but before he could do that, he felt a prick on his neck and he blacked out. Chapter 4. General's Office, Euphra Defense Forces HQ. Peters stood outside the door to the general's office. He took a deep breath as he pressed on the panel. This would be the first time he was stepping into this office whereby it wouldn't be his father seated behind the desk. As long as he had served, his father had been general. But with his father's retirement, things were different. A new chapter in the Euphra Defense Forces had begun. Come in, a voice hollered from inside. The door slid open and Peters stepped inside the office. The space looked the same as before. It appeared that General Williams hadn't done any major changes to the space, at least not yet. Peters walked up to the desk and saluted. General Williams saluted back. Captain, take a seat. Peters bowed and sat down. He wasn't sure why General Williams had wanted to see him. There had been nothing pressing that he had to report back to HQ. He had already submitted the report on his unit's encounter with the Rukpli a few months back to General Myers. Williams hadn't replied to him on that report. Williams stared at him. Your father is a hero. Let me rephrase that. He is a legend. I was honored when he picked me to become general. Yes, sir, Peters said. Was this why Williams had called him to his office? Peters doubted. Reminiscing about his father wasn't necessary. He knew that General Myers had picked the right man for the job. Anyway, he passed me the report you submitted on this Rukpli alien species, Williams highlighted. I was impressed that your unit was able to find a way to detect the Rukpli. It was a makeshift solution, and I have to also give credit to Stanley and his XO, who also developed a similar solution, Peters said. Williams nodded. I understand. The reason I called you in today is because I have a new task for you, and your unit has the most experience with this Rukpli alien species. Peters realized that was true, but it was also a weakness because many more units needed combat experience with the Rukpli. I'm giving you operational control over the Euphra defense forces in charge of protecting Arcadia as well as the Trebium mineral project, Williams announced. Peters remained emotionless. Understood, sir. Williams eyed him carefully. You may be wondering why Colonel Ramirez isn't involved in the operation. He has other duties that I need him to take charge of, especially in relation to the other cities. Euphra isn't all about Arcadia. We do have many other cities that require protection as well, and right now we are stretched thin for various reasons. Although Peters didn't show it, he was reeling from the new mission being assigned to him. Protection of Arcadia was no easy feat, and coupled with the Trebium mineral project, he would have his hands full. I will leave it to you to decide how to delegate your work, but it's imperative that we protect the city as well as the Trebium mineral project, Williams advised. If, as your report suggests, that the Rukpli are after the Trebium, then we have many more things we need to do. The Trebium protection around this office and my quarters is effective, but it isn't sustainable. Peters glanced around the space. He hadn't noticed the Trebium protection, but assumed it had been done with the intention of not being visible to the naked eye. However, he recalled that it was one of General Meyer's last commands before retirement to ensure the protection of the key leaders of the Euphra Defense Forces as well as UFS. I will begin work on it, Peters said. Is there anything else, sir? Yes, Williams said. You will directly report to me on this specific mission. Is that clear? Peters didn't find the reporting structure unusual. He suspected General Myers must have advised Williams on it. The current crisis warranted such flexibility. Yes, General, Peters replied. Peters stood up and was about to leave the room when Williams interrupted him. One more thing. In case you're wondering, this new mission wasn't assigned to you by General Myers. Peters narrowed his eyes. Admiral Sheldon recommended you as the right person for the job, Williams said. Peters acknowledged him. Then, two beeps began to ring loudly in the room. One came from his device. Peters picked up the device and examined it. It was a short message. Red alert. Explosions on Arcadia Quadrant A4. Chapter 5. Trebium Mine, outside of Tum. The drilling sound penetrated the makeshift office of Marine Captain Faulkner. It had become a daily and nightly ritual for Faulkner ever since his unit had been deployed to the Trebium mine outside of Tum, a smaller city northwest of Arcadia. Tum was one of those cities that came into existence due to the mine. If not for the mine, he doubted there would be a city in such a location on Euphra. While Tum was a smaller city, it had drawn its fair share of people who wanted to work in the Trebium mine, as well as those who were just attracted to the Trebium by curiosity. His unit's deployment had been done hastily 3 months ago in response to the sudden attack by the Rukpli alien species. At the time, Faulkner had been excited with the prospect of protecting the Trebium-rich mine. It seemed like a welcome change from the usual training his unit would typically undergo at their base. After all, he realized that the Trebium was the foundation of the new class of UFS destroyers. However, over the last 3 months, the constant drilling by the robot drillers had begun to slowly eat away at his excitement. Faulkner had assigned his unit in different rotations to secure the entrance to the Trebium mine. While most of the drilling was done by the robot drillers, it still required a small handful of humans to operate the robot. The robot drillers had been something they had brought over from Earth years ago, and these machines had been effective in helping build the initial cities on Euphra. After many years, their use became less important as it was decided there were more than enough cities across the two continents of the planet. But then, with the discovery of Trebium, all that changed. The robot drillers had a second chance in life, and ever since then had been used non-stop to mine the Trebium. It was a good use of the machines as some of the mining happened in deeper areas of the planet's core, which could be potentially hazardous to humans. There was a buzz at his door, if he could even call it that. Lieutenant Brandt stepped in. Yes, Lieutenant, Faulkner asked. Captain, Jose injured himself and needs to rest, Brandt announced. Faulkner frowned. How could one of his members injure themselves when they were just standing guard around the mine entrance? There was no danger around him. He sighed. It was a sign that his men and women were getting complacent. He had been worried that might happen as the months dragged on. Now it had. And he knew it wouldn't be the last time he heard of such things. Okay, let him rest, Faulkner said. You need to keep the unit active. I don't want people becoming bored and getting themselves unnecessarily injured. Affirmative, sir, Brandt said. Are they going to send another unit to replace us soon? Brandt was being too hopeful. Faulkner shook his head. Not in the near future. We need to keep reminding our unit to stay alert because the Trebium is a critical resource that's helping build our future defenses. Without the Trebium, we could be all dead. Brandt nodded reluctantly as he left the office. Faulkner didn't like the situation. Although he would never say it aloud, he also hoped UFS Central Command would rotate in another unit to replace his one. At least it would give his unit some time to do proper training exercises back at Titanic Base. Chapter 6, Arcadia, Euphra. Peters glanced around at each of his men and women in the unit. All of them were outfitted with enhanced Trebium armor. It was less heavy than the makeshift ones they had used on board Armstrong Station. During the first month since the Rukpli attack, large quantities of Trebium had been diverted to create the armor at a breakneck pace. No one had questioned the movement of resources. Even the Euphra Council had wholeheartedly supported the initiative. Lieutenant Cruz was unusually quiet. She hadn't asked any questions once he had activated his unit. In addition to his unit, 2 others were also en route to Quadrant A4 of Arcadia. They would land at the bomb site a few minutes apart from his combat shuttle. There was a beep on his comms link. It was General Williams. "We got initial footage via the Euphranet media," Williams said. "I'm sending it across to you. The Euphra security services have been activated and are on site right now, but I have informed them that you remain in charge." With that, the comms link went off. The Euphra security services is going to be a problem. For whatever reason, there were always issues between the Euphra Defense Forces and the Euphra Security Services. He hadn't had the opportunity to interact with them, but those who had didn't have anything good to say about the Euphra Security Services. Sometimes Peters wished the Euphra Council hadn't established the Euphra Security Services. Although their role and jurisdiction was different from his unit, it still complicated matters. He didn't expect any less when he reached the bomb site. Peters pulled out his device and played the video footage. He grimaced. The bomb site consisted of 2 3-floor buildings, which were badly damaged, and there was a lot of smoke. He couldn't tell much more until they got on the ground. Cruz leaned towards him. "Do you think it's the Rukpli? If it's them, how did they get through our orbital defenses?" Peters asked. There were multiple points of scans being performed around the clock on Armstrong Station, UFS Intrepid, UFS Winston, and several other older class destroyers stationed around Euphra. They even had eyes on Lenore 1 and 2. This around-the-clock surveillance had been part of the immediate steps the UFS had taken in light of the attack by the Rukpli. Likewise, Euphra Defense Forces had been put on high alert for the last 3 months. Patrols had been increased around the perimeter and within the city limits. Despite that, the Euphra Council had voiced concerns that all of the protection shouldn't create an atmosphere of fear amongst the population. They had highlighted it was important for people to have a sense of normalcy. At that time, General Myers had assured the Euphra Council that the extra patrols would be invisible to the general population. Depending on the situation at the bomb site, all of those assurances may no longer matter. The combat shuttle began to descend onto a flat land away from the bomb site. Peters got his first eyes on the smoke drifting up into the sky. "Everyone, this is an active combat zone," Peters shouted. "We do not know if the hostiles are still around or how many of them are out there. Proceed with caution. Keep your eyes and ears open to anything." Each of the members in his unit nodded their understanding as the shuttle landed on the ground. Peters stepped off the shuttle and leveled his weapon in front of him. His head-mounted display activated itself and began scanning the vicinity. In a few seconds, his display identified the 3 damaged buildings and life signs around the destroyed structures. A uniformed man came up to him. "Captain Peters?" Peters nodded. "My name is Lieutenant Rukpli," the man announced. "I am the ranking officer from the Euphra Security Services." "What do we know so far?" Peters asked as he kept walking towards the ruins of the 3 buildings. 10 people are dead, 30 injured, Rukpli reported. "Half of those injured are critical. Most of the floors in the building were empty except for a few, which were occupied, but with minimal numbers of people. We were fortunate that the number of casualties was limited to 10. Peters couldn't believe what this Euphra Security Services lieutenant was saying. 10 dead was unheard of in Arcadia. In fact, it could be the first deaths ever recorded by an attack on the human population within the city's perimeter, and in fact on Euphra. The normalcy that the Euphra Council had hoped for was gone. Once the citizens saw the video footage, panic would begin to arise. It was important to get the situation under control as soon as possible. Then Cruz's voice crackled through his comms link. "Distortion detected towards the leftmost building." Chapter 7, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Captain Stanley was monitoring his console. The UFS Intrepid had been positioned on the far side of Euphra. Their daily routine for the last few months had been to roam the assigned area and keep scanning for any signs of the Rukpli. Initially, the urgency had kept him and the crew motivated. However, over time, as the days dragged into weeks and months, boredom had begun to show its ugly face. Stanley knew the danger of his crew slipping into complacency. It was the last thing he needed right now. The Rukpli could easily take advantage of their complacency and strike like they did the last time. He had ordered his XO to run training drills across the vessel to ensure the crew were ready for any attack from the Rukpli. Fortunately, there had been no further grumblings amongst the crew. His XO had been proactive to highlight it, which had put Stanley's mind at ease. It had also been an opportunity for the crew to train on the new mag-rail assault weapons they had received from UFS Central Command. His XO had commented that the crew were quite fascinated by the new assault weapon and were hungry to learn and use it. Stanley had recognized the assault weapon as the same one ones that Peters and his unit had used during their engagement with the Rukpli. The last engagement with the Rukpli had taught Stanley that his crew, although not Marines, still had to be prepared. A buzz appeared on his console. It was Admiral Sheldon. "Captain, you may not be aware, but there was an attack on Arcadia a little while ago," Sheldon announced. Stanley was surprised to hear about it. "Is it the Rukpli?" "That is yet to be determined, but we have multiple casualties at the bomb site," Sheldon said. "The situation there is serious." "What do you need us to do?" Stanley asked. "A few hours ago, an alert was also sent out by one of the Euphra Defense Forces patrols on Aurora," Sheldon highlighted. "As your vessel is the closest to Aurora, I want you to take down a shuttle to investigate it. I suspect it's related to the Rukpli." "Yes, Admiral," Stanley replied. Once the comms link turned off, Stanley turned to his XO. "I need to take a shuttle down to Aurora." "Why you, sir?" the XO asked. "The Admiral believes it may be linked to the Rukpli," Stanley replied. Sheldon must have had a strong suspicion to activate him. If not, the Admiral wasn't the kind of person to ask a captain of a destroyer to personally go and investigate something. "Did you hear about the explosions on Arcadia?" Stanley asked. "I just saw it on the comms," the XO remarked. "Not much official details, but the media are reporting casualties. It looks bad." Stanley frowned. The lack of official details implied that the bomb site was still an active zone. He didn't know how the civilian population would react to the attacks, but he knew a reaction was coming. No one on Euphra had experienced such an attack over the last 50 years. If it is them, how did they get through our scans, the XO mused. That was an important question. Stanley had serious doubts that the Rukpli could have avoided their scans and landed on the planet's surface undetected. However, they didn't have a comprehensive assessment of the alien species' capabilities. It was still possible that the Rukpli had different ways to evade their sensors. That itself was disturbing. Stanley stood up. "You have the bridge. Ensure the crew continue to do the training drills." Chapter 8. Quadrant A4, Arcadia. Peters ran towards the area that Lieutenant Cruz had highlighted and took cover behind a burnt-up transport pod. The heat from the pod tingled his skin. He heard the shuffling of feet behind him and assumed it was Lieutenant Rukpli. Why did that man have to be here? There were people still hobbling around in the distance behind him. 3 medical units had arrived on the scene and the medical officers were helping some of the injured. "What do you see?" Rukpli asked. Peters shook his head. "Stay quiet and behind this pod." He didn't have time to explain everything to Rukpli. The Euphra Security Services man had no idea what they were dealing with. "Cruz, what's your position?" Peters asked through the comms link. "Captain, I am half a click to your left," Cruz replied. "It's a single alien and it disappeared into the ruins of the building." The positions of his team began appearing in green on his head-mounted display. He made a mental note of their positions. Thoughts began to race through his mind. How did the alien get to this location? It couldn't have simply walked into the city, or had a vessel dropped it off near this location. "Take 2 people with you and take the left flank," Peters ordered. "Order the rest to take the right flank. Let's try to flush it out." "Acknowledged," Cruz said. The green figures on his head-mounted display began to move on to either side of the remains of the building. Peters knew it was a risk attacking the alien with so many people around, but there was no choice. The only advantage they had was that the alien hadn't jumped into a human. At least not yet. If it had jumped into a human body, they wouldn't have been able to detect the distortion. "It has stopped moving," Cruz whispered. Peters sent the orders for both sides to discharge their weapons. A barrage of weapons fire erupted on both sides of him. The screams of people consumed the area behind him. Peters turned to Rukpli. "Get all those people away from here as quickly as possible." Rukpli nodded and disappeared from his sight. Peters was relieved to get the Euphra Security Services man off his back. He was becoming too much of a distraction. "Give me a status update," Peters asked. "The alien didn't move at all," Cruz said. Then a shrill sound emerged from the ruined building. Peters didn't like it one bit. It was followed by a series of explosions. "Take cover," Cruz shouted. "The alien's firing." Peters ducked down as an explosion occurred a few meters away from his position. The ground shook as another explosion rocked near him. It was the first time any Rukpli alien had fired back at them. The explosions continued for a few more seconds before silence descended on the bomb site. There was no more screaming from behind him. He assumed that the Euphra Security Services had managed to get everyone away from this area. "Has anyone got the alien in their sights?" Peters asked his unit. All the members in his unit replied that they couldn't see it. The Rukpli alien was intelligent enough to stay out of sight. Cruz was becoming impatient. "What's it doing? Why is it waiting?" Then Peters realized what was about to happen. "Everyone, move in on the alien now. Do not shoot to kill." If they were able to get the Rukpli alien alive, it would provide them with a valuable source of intelligence. Peter stood up and darted forward from behind the burnt transport pod. As he raced, his head-mounted display revealed the green figures in his team all converging in on the building. "I don't see it," Cruz yelled. "Wait, I got it in my sights." "Copy that," Peter said as he kept running with his weapon in front of him. But by the time he reached Cruz's position, it was too late. One look on Cruz's face told him everything he needed to know. "It just vanished in front of our eyes," Cruz lamented, kicking the dirt under her feet. "I should have taken it down." "We have a bigger problem," Peter said. If the Rukpli alien had vanished, it meant only one thing. There was an alien vessel somewhere around the vicinity. Chapter 9, Science Division 1, Arcadia. Humphreys paced up and down his laboratory. It had been a few hours since he had observed the Rukpli cell latching onto the human cell. However, the Rukpli cell didn't try to penetrate the human cell. Instead, it merely held onto the human cell. Finn's voice crackled through the hollow screen. "Are you still there?" Humphreys grunted. "Where else would I be?" "Haven't you heard about the attack?" Finn asked. "Attack?" Humphreys asked. "You really haven't stepped out of the lab, have you?" Finn remarked. "There was an attack at Quadrant A4. Multiple people died. Sometimes it is good to find out what's going on outside the lab." Humphreys stopped pacing and looked at the holoscreen. "Was it the alien species?" "Official news reported that it was an attack from an unknown enemy," Finn replied. "My guess is that it's the code for the alien species." Humphreys frowned. "Did they capture it?" Finn shook his head. "I heard from my captain that those aliens are very good at vanishing when you least expect it, which makes them very hard to catch. But I don't know in this case what's going on." "We need to find a way to prevent the alien cell from latching onto our one," Humphreys remarked. "If there's anyone on Euphra who can find that out, it will be you," Finn said. "Thank you for your vote of confidence in me," Humphreys smiled. "While you were away, I've been trying a host of things and nothing is working. Let me show you something else that was disturbing." He swiped another view onto the hollow screen. "This is a recording of multiple human cells that have been taken over by the Rukpli ones. Do you notice anything unusual?" Finn narrowed his eyes. "I cannot tell. It looks like the Rukpli ones are all covering the human cells." "Look again closely, but this time at the movements," Humphreys advised. Finn paused for a bit. "I don't believe it. Are you saying?" Humphreys interrupted him. "They are moving in unison as one. The latch cells are working together." "How's that even possible?" Finn asked in disbelief. "I don't know. I have never before encountered such a thing." "Can we disrupt the cells working together?" Finn inquired. "That might force them not to stay in the host body." Humphrey stared at the chief medical officer. "Finn, you continue to surprise me. Now that's an idea." Chapter 10, Outside Perimeter, Aurora. Stanley stepped off the shuttle with 4 of his crew. All of them had worn the Trebium armor which had been sent to the UFS Intrepid a month ago. He had been glad that Admiral Sheldon had pulled many strings to ensure all UFS crews in space were provided with them. It was the first time he had donned the armor and he didn't feel a thing. It was as light as it could be. He led the group around the hill. Once they rounded the corner, he came upon a group of armed guards from the Euphra Defense Forces. These guards were stationed in a perimeter around the cave entrance, which loomed behind them. From his vantage point, he was glad to observe that the Euphra Defense Forces guards were also wearing the same Trebium armor. The last thing he wanted was for a Rukpli alien to have jumped into one of them. One of the guards approached Stanley. "Captain Stanley?" Stanley nodded. "What's the status here?" "Once we got here, we found a patrol vehicle parked a distance away," the armed guard replied. "The vehicle was empty. From what we know, 2 sergeants were on patrol in that vehicle. One of the 2 sergeants routinely does the patrol of this part of the perimeter." Stanley realized it meant something had changed recently, very recently. If not, the sergeant doing the routine patrol would have detected it earlier. "Any life signs?" Stanley asked. "Negative, sir," the armed guard said. "We cordoned off the whole area. As per instructions, no one has gone into the cave." "We'll go in then," Stanley announced. "Keep scanning the area for any life signs." There was no need to take a chance with the possibility of the Rukpli around. The armed guard nodded and created an opening for him and his crew to go through. Stanley pulled his weapon and leveled it in front of him as he approached the cave. "Lieutenant Maury, take the rear," Stanley ordered. His crew got into position as they neared the cave. At the entrance of the cave, Stanley raised his hand to stop. Officer Gilman scanned for any distortions. He didn't expect any, but it was better to confirm it. Gilman pulled out his device and took a step forward ahead of him. Stanley waited as he observed the Euphra Defense Forces guards stealing glances at them. He guessed they must be wondering why a UFS captain and crew had been called into the situation. There was no need to explain to them the reasons behind their appearance at the cave. Gilman interrupted his thoughts. "No distortion, sir." Stanley gestured and they inched forward into the cave. The lights in the cave caught his attention. He suspected that must have drawn the 2 soldiers deeper into the cave, but he still didn't understand why the patrol vehicle had stopped at the hill. Something else must have brought them to the hill. Had they noticed the distortion? But if they had, they would have called it in sooner and not walked into the cave. So it couldn't have been a distortion. It must have been something else. A few moments later, Stanley stopped. Ahead of him was a cluster of tables and workstations. It eerily reminded him of what Commander Mendez and his team had discovered on Lenoa 1. At the same time, it also confirmed his worst fear. This cave had been occupied by the Rukpli aliens. "Spread out and check the cave," Stanley ordered, as he walked to the center workstation. The symbols on the workstation controls only confirmed his suspicion of the presence of the Rukpli. If the aliens had been here, where had they gone? And how had they gotten here in the first place? Ever since the end of the first engagement with the Rukpli, Admiral Sheldon and the then General Myers had mounted an effort to scan all the cities and their perimeters for any distortions. It had been a massive effort as they had to mobilize a large number of shuttles and smaller vehicles and vessels to travel across the cities on Euphra. By the end of the second month, it had been completed successfully. And, most significantly, the exercise itself had concluded with no detections of any distortions. The exercise had given everyone peace of mind. But Stanley had known that would be temporary. Eventually, the Rukpli would return. Looking at the symbols, it had been faster than he had expected. Stanley opened a comms link to his XO. Commander, I'm sending you some Rukpli symbols we found outside of Aurora. Can you send me a translation? The last 3 months had also seen a good amount of progress in translating the Rukpli symbols. Lieutenant Diaz and a team on Armstrong Station had worked tirelessly to figure out the symbols. Stanley had assigned Mendez to liaise with Diaz and a team throughout that period. I'm sending it down to you, his XO replied. Stanley's eyes widened. That was quick. Diaz must have shared the data with his XO. The device in his hands displayed the translation of the symbols. Stanley looked at the controls again and then pressed on one of them. Nothing happened. He waited. Maybe the translation was wrong. Then there was a series of beeps as the workstation in front of him turned on. A few of his crew turned back to him, but he motioned for them to continue searching around the cave. There was another beep, and a holographic projection appeared mid-air in front of him. Initially, it looked like a layout of a place. Was this a Rukpli city? If so, where was it located? Then he stopped. There was something familiar about the layout of the city. What was it? Stanley examined it closely. It then dawned on him what his eyes were looking at. It was a layout of Arcadia. Chapter 11, Admiral's Office, UFS Central Command. Sheldon stared at the video footage being reported by the media on the Euphra net. He frowned as the reporters on the ground highlighted more of the images of the dead. This was a nightmare. It reminded him of the old images from Earth during its last days. How could this be happening on Arcadia? He never thought he would be alive to see such a crisis unfolding in this colony. Many people who had traveled to the one-year system had been sold on the dream that Euphra would be a new start for humanity. And for many years, that dream seemed to have been fulfilled as humanity had slowly expanded across the continent. Peace had reigned supreme as the wars and disasters of Earth became a distant memory, but the dream was now being shaken to the core. Then the comms bust. It was Captain Stanley. It was about time. He had been waiting to hear from Stanley for a while now. He couldn't understand why it had taken Stanley so long to contact him. Stanley, I've been waiting for your update, Sheldon scoffed. He wasn't Admiral Harris and didn't care if Stanley got offended by his tone. Things were beginning to slowly unravel on Arcadia. It would be a matter of time before the citizens became wary and fearful, and then they would start to question the leaders of Euphra. Admiral, we found evidence that the cave outside the Aurora perimeter had Rukpli in it, Stanley admitted. Sheldon wasn't convinced. Are you absolutely sure of it? Yes, sir, Stanley replied. There were workstations with the same symbols as those we found on Lenore 1. Sheldon grimaced and raised his fist in anger. Fortunately, he wasn't on a hollow screen with Stanley. There's more, sir. What else could there be? How much worse can it be than to know that the Rukpli had an operation center on Euphra itself? All it meant was that the last 3 months of protecting the planet had come to naught. They had again failed in their duty. Sheldon struggled to control his frustrations. Go ahead. We managed to start up one of the Rukpli workstations and found a map of Arcadia on it, Stanley announced. I'm sending it over to you now. Sheldon's eyes narrowed. What's your assessment? The map could mean they are targeting specific locations in Arcadia, Stanley suggested. I'll inform General Williams immediately, Sheldon said. Try to find anything else you can in that cave. We need more intelligence about the Rukpli and their intentions. If the Rukpli had developed a map of Arcadia, it meant they had been watching the capital city for a while. Yes, Admiral, Stanley replied, and the comms ended. Sheldon frowned. Was this the next phase of the Rukpli's attack on humanity? If it was, the aliens were intent on destabilizing the capital city. But what was the endgame in attacking Arcadia? He sent the transmission and the recovered map to General Williams. Chapter 12. Outside perimeter Aurora. Stanley realized Admiral Sheldon was under a lot of pressure to produce results against the Rukpli alien species. Ever since the initial attack, UFS Central Command hadn't promoted any new admirals, leaving the whole responsibility to be shouldered by Sheldon. Stanley couldn't understand why the Euphra Council hadn't initiated new promotions at the admiral rank. It was necessary. Although several lieutenants had been promoted to captains and all, one admiral was an oversight on the part of the Euphra Council, at least in his opinion. Captain, Lieutenant Maury said, you should take a look at this, sir. Stanley stood and turned around inside the cave. Maury and another one of his men was standing further inside. He walked towards them. Maury pointed at the wall. There's a door on this wall. Stanley recognized the etchings around the wall. Look for a panel to open it. It's already open, sir, Maury remarked as he used his fingers to pull the door open. Stanley was a bit annoyed that Maury had simply opened the door without taking any precautions. For all they knew, there could have been some Rukpli inside there waiting for them. Just because they had the Trebium armor on them, it wasn't a reason to take things easy. the Rukpli could still find other ways to harm them. As the door swung outward, Stanley stepped back and leveled his weapon in front of him. It was only then that Maury realized his mistake. He also stepped back in case there was anyone inside. "Maury, you go first and be careful," Stanley whispered. Maury nodded and went through a door with Stanley a step behind him. Stanley found himself standing in a larger-than-expected chamber. The chamber walls were the original rock of the hill. He realized this chamber had probably been around for a long time. It wasn't something that could have been built overnight or even during the last 3 months. But that wasn't the part of the chamber that stunned him. Instead, it was the floor-to-ceiling glass casings that lined up on either side of the walls of the chamber. Maury pointed around the glass casings. "What are these?" Stanley recognized them. "They are Rukpli weapons." He slowly stood at one glass casing and examined it. Inside the casing was a weapon. It was larger than their magwell weapon. This was the first time he had seen such a weapon. The Rukpli he had encountered on the UFS Intrepid had used the officer's own weapon against them. He began to walk along the glass casing on the right side of the chamber. The next few glass casings all had a similar type of weapon. Then he stopped. The glass casing in front of him had a weapon with a thick blade on both ends. The edge of the blade could easily take off an arm or even behead someone. "Are we sure these belong to the Rukpli?" Maury asked. It was a reasonable question. Stanley was also beginning to doubt his theory. If these weapons belonged to the Rukpli, why was this the first time they were seeing them? He made a mental note to check this with his XO. "Take some images of these and send them back to the XO," Stanley directed. Maury and another man began capturing images of the weapon. It was only then that Stanley noticed another door on the back wall of the chamber. How big was this place? He still couldn't believe all of this was inside the hill. Maury turned to him. "Do you want us to take these back for further study?" "No, don't touch them," Stanley warned, prompting Maury and the rest of his crew to step away from the glass casings. He recalled the toxic black blood from the dead Rukpli. There was no telling what these weapons were made of and whether they could be dangerous for humans. The very fact that they were stored in glass casings was disturbing and ominous at the same time. Stanley turned his attention back to the rear door in the chamber. "Maury, cover me." Maury stepped beside him and he leveled his weapon in front as Stanley pressed against the door. The door shifted and opened inwards. Stanley's eyes widened as he witnessed a space the size of a large hangar bay. Maury went through the door first, followed by Stanley and the rest of his crew. "Maury, how many vessels could be stored in this hangar bay?" Stanley asked as he walked further in. Maury looked surprised by his question and paused for a long moment. "If they are the size of our shuttle, maybe 3 to 4, sir." Stanley nodded. Or the hangar bay could hold a single larger vessel. He realized they were on the back end of the hill, which must have been extended by the alien species to contain this hangar bay structure. He couldn't understand how this place had continued to operate under the radar of the Euphra Defense Forces. It was another lapse in security protocols. He recognized that the Rukpli may have had a shield that prevented anyone from detecting their presence. If that was the case, what led them to being detected now? Stanley's thoughts were broken by Maury's urgent words. "Don't touch that." Stanley turned his attention towards the other end of the hangar bay structure. It was too late. What was wrong with his crew? Didn't they understand that they weren't supposed to touch anything? One of his junior crew members had pressed on a panel. The long door to the hangar bay structure began to slide upwards. As the door opened, Stanley gritted his teeth. He was fuming with the junior officer. Their lack of experience in the field was so telling. Then, before he could say anything, a shimmer caught his eye. His chest began pounding. A vessel was waiting outside for them. He knew it could be none other than that of the Rukpli aliens. It was a trap, and they had walked into it. "Get out of here," Stanley shouted as he ran towards the chamber with the glass casings. The sound of the launch of multiple missiles invaded his ears as he leaped into the chamber. Chapter 13. Trebium mine outside of Tum. Captain Faulkner's console buzzed. The evening shift was about to start. He typically would stand outside and observe the previous shift leave and the new shift come in. Last month, he had initiated new protocols to check the identification of each worker as well as to do a body scan. It was part of the new security protocols initiated due to the appearance of the Rukpli alien species. Initially, the workers on shift who came from the nearby city of Tum had grumbled. Some had even written in their complaints citing the additional burden these new protocols would take. Faulkner had addressed them as necessary security protocols to protect both the workers, the robot drillers, and the Trebium mine. His words had helped ease their fears, but Faulkner didn't know how long that would last. His observation of the change of shifts would have to wait. It was Captain Peters. The holoscreen opened and Peters' face appeared. "Yes, Captain." Even though they were of the same rank, Captain Peters far outweighed him in terms of experience. There was also the hidden factor that this was the son of General Myers. And although General Myers had retired, Faulkner wasn't going to reveal his true feelings to Peters. The truth of the matter was that he didn't like Peters. He found Peters to be arrogant and brash. Faulkner didn't know whether or not it was his jealousy showing their colors whenever he talked to Peters. "Faulkner, we had an attack at our Arcadia, Peters reported. I heard about it, Faulkner said. It had been shocking to hear of an attack on civilians. It was the first such attack ever since he could remember. Euphra and humanity had been fortunate to be spared of the issues back on Earth. However, things were changing rapidly. General Williams has given me operational control over the soldiers protecting Arcadia and the Trebium mine, Peters said. So, I need you to double up the patrols around the Trebium mine effective immediately. Faulkner wasn't surprised Peters had gotten operational control. Faulkner had actually expected it to happen. This was probably the result of General Myers still pulling the strings even after his retirement. Sir, we already have significant patrols around the clock, Faulkner interjected. His men and women were quite tired of the patrols. There was nothing of significance happening out here. The Trebium mine had been discovered 100 clicks from the nearest city of Tum. Even the workers on ship had to be transported to and fro Tum. From a security standpoint, the location of the mine was ideal as it was isolated from the average citizen. However, Faulkner was aware that the isolation was also a double-edged sword. If anything happened out here, they would be trapped because it would take time for reinforcements to arrive. I understand, Peter said, but in light of the recent attack, increase the patrols for the interim period. I will get back to you when we can return to the normal patrol schedule. Yes, sir, Faulkner said as the holoscreen went back. He scoffed at Peters. Once the frequency of patrols was increased, the chances of them being returned to normal was minimal. He stood and went out of the makeshift office to brief his unit of the news. Chapter 14. Outside Perimeter Aurora. Stanley rolled on the ground until he stopped at the chamber's front door. The hill continued to shake from the missiles hitting the hangar bay structure. Dust began to fall from the ceiling of the chamber he was in. A loud shattering permeated the chamber. Something had shattered part of the glass casing holding the Rukpli weapons. Everyone, get out of this cave, Stanley shouted as he stood. The ground below him began to shift ever so slightly. The back chamber door was missing, as was most of the wall. He glanced around. Only 2 of his crew were with him. Lieutenant Maury wasn't among them. Stanley sighed as he stumbled forward through the chamber's front door and into the cave with a cluster of tables and workstations. Another explosion rocked the hill. The alien vessel had been waiting for them. Stanley grimaced. He should have known better than to walk into a hangar bay structure. The alien vessel had wanted to kill as many of them as it could. The anger began to rise in him. His ears were still partially muffled as he again felt the ground shift under him. Captain, this way, one of his men shouted. Stanley began to run out towards the cave entrance. At the entrance, the Euphra defense forces were standing around. What were they doing? Hadn't they heard the explosions? He had expected them to do something instead of stand there. He waved at them to get back. There's an alien vessel on the other side of this hill, Stanley reported to the Euphra defense forces. Call it in and make sure no one enters the cave. Affirmative, sir, one of the armed men said. Stanley turned around to glance back at the cave. In a few moments, there was another blast of dirt and rock and the cave entrance collapsed on itself. He staggered backwards, covering his eyes as more dust flew in every direction. Not only had the alien vessel wanted to kill them, but it had wanted to destroy all evidence of their activities in the cave. Stanley groaned, knowing that Maury and the other 2 crew members' bodies were buried under a massive amount of rubble. It would take a significant amount of time to retrieve their bodies. Stanley punched his fist in the air as he thought about his 3 dead crew. This shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have even allowed it. One of his crew approached him. Captain, I have a reading on my device. I think that alien vessel is still around on the other side of the hill. Was the alien vessel planning on coming to this side of the hill to finish off what it had started? Everyone, take cover, Stanley yelled. Then he had an idea and motioned to his 2 men. Come with me, we're going to the shuttle. Stanley and the 2 men raced back to the shuttle. Out of the corner of his eye, he observed the Euphra defense forces pulling back from the cave entrance and taking cover. He hoped reinforcements would be sent to the hill, but he knew by then it would be too late, at least for his dead crew. He doubted any of them would have survived such a blast. Once they reached the shuttle, Stanley rushed inside followed by his 2 men. One of his men sat in the cockpit while Stanley took the seat beside him. Take us around the other side of the hill, Stanley ordered. The shuttle turned about and began making its way around the hill. In a few moments, it reached the other side of the hill. There was a huge gaping hole on the other side of the hill. A cloud of smoke still covered the area which had been attacked by the enemy vessel, but there was no sign of the alien vessel that had fired upon them. Stanley suspected that it couldn't have gone too far. Use the modified sensors to detect any trace of the vessel, Stanley ordered. He hoped the same modified sensors would work here. Stanley waited while his officer worked on the sensors. He was still upset with himself for walking into the Rukpli trap. He realized that the Rukpli must have wanted to draw in more people with the intention of killing them. The door to the chamber with the glass casing had been intentionally left open. That should have been a warning, but he failed to discern it. Captain, I got a faint trail, the officer said. Follow it, Stanley directed. Chapter 15, Science Division 1, Arcadia. Is it ready? Finn asked through the holoscreen. Humphreys carried over the emitter and placed it next to the samples. I'm getting there. Give me a few more minutes. Okay, Finn said. Finn, I'm not as young as I used to be. Humphrey scoffed. Neither am I, Finn said. Humphreys turned the holoscreen towards the emitter and the samples. The Rukpli cells were still latched to the human cells and continued to produce that synchronous movement. If it had been any other occasion, he would have been enraptured by the movement. But knowing that such movement led to the host body being completely under the control of the alien was disturbing and shocking. He switched on the emitter and adjusted the settings. I'm going to first try a low value on the scale. This was going to be an exercise of trial and error. There was no way around it. The basic idea was whether a sound in the ultrasonic range could disrupt the movement of the Rukpli cells. Such a sound wouldn't be heard by humans, but other species were known to pick it up. Initially, it seemed like an interesting thought, but as Humphreys began to trigger the sound, he started to have doubts. Could something like this work? It had never before been attempted. There was no scientific basis for it, but considering that they were on Euphra, far away from Earth, and dealing with Rukpli cells that latched onto human cells, their choices were limited. Here we go, Humphreys announced as he pressed one of the buttons on the emitter. That was quiet, Finn smirked. Before you say anything, I'm aware we cannot hear it. Did anything change? Your view is as good as mine, Humphreys said. Nothing had changed with the cells, nothing at all. Humphreys began adjusting the dial and pressing the button on the emitter again. He waited patiently and observed the samples. Nothing. Then he adjusted it again and tried. And this went on for the next several minutes. As the minutes dragged on, Humphreys began to think they were going down a dead end. If this didn't work, he also didn't know what else they could try. Did you see that? Finn shouted. Finn's voice caught Humphreys by surprise. He took his hands off the emitter and examined the samples. What happened? I thought I saw a small reaction from one of the Rukpli cells, Finn said. The readings on the display didn't indicate anything. Maybe Finn was seeing things. There it's again, Finn remarked. Do you see it? This time, Humphrey saw it too. One of the Rukpli cells had unlatched itself on one of its sides. Then the action repeated itself on the other side, and eventually the Rukpli cell moved away from the human cell. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed it. The ultrasonic sound was having an impact on the Rukpli cells. It was forcing them to separate themselves from the human cells. I think it's about to happen on the other cell too, Finn commented. The process repeated itself with the other cell. It was a slow process, but the outcome was the same. We got it, Humphreys chimed. Let me take down the settings on the emitter. Finn, I'll send you a copy of it. Finn nodded. This is what we need. But does the unlatching let the human cells continue to survive? As if to answer that question, the human cells dissolved immediately. Humphreys sighed. The moment the unlatching happened, the humans still died. We still need to find out more, but it's a first step, Humphrey said. It's much more than a first. Finn's voice trailed off. An alarm went off inside the space. What's that? Finn asked. Humphreys swiped the holoscreen to check on the security monitors. An image of the security post at the building foyer popped up. It was empty. There should have been 2 guards seated there at all times. It was part of the standard security protocols at Science Division 1. I think we have an intruder, Humphrey said, as he glanced towards the door. He quickly raced to the front door and secured it. He returned to the holoscreen. Something is wrong. I'm unable to contact any of the armed guards who are supposed to be protecting this building. Get out of there, Finn advised. I'll inform the Euphra Defense Forces. Don't wait. Get out now. Humphreys picked up the emitter, glanced at the emergency exit door in the rear, and ran towards it. Chapter 16, Sick Bay, UFS Intrepid. Finn knew he didn't have the time to explain everything to Commander Mendes. Humphrey's life was at stake. He suspected the use of the Rukpli cells must have triggered a transmission of the location back to the Rukpli aliens. It was the only thing that made sense. He opened the holoscreen to General Williams, whose face appeared, and the general seemed irritated at being disturbed. If it had been General Myers, Finn wouldn't have even flinched, as he knew Myers from their younger days. Williams was someone he didn't know much about other than that he had served Myers faithfully for many years. Finn swallowed. General, this is Finn. Williams interrupted him. I'm aware of that when I accepted your comms. Finn was flustered. I apologize for breaking protocol, but there is an urgent matter at hand and it may involve the alien species. Williams narrowed his eyes. Explain. Finn briefly shared the experiments that he and Humphreys were involved in at Science Division 1. After he had finished sharing, Williams intensely stared at him. Are you saying you may have found a way to destabilize the alien when it's occupying a host body? Yes, General, Finn said. Williams' facial expression changed. This is incredibly good news. It's about time we turned the tables on these aliens. But now I believe there's an alien trying to get to Humphreys, Finn reported. Finn knew he was going on a gut feeling, but somehow he felt it was correct. I'll immediately send a unit to his location, Williams replied. Williams looked off screen as Finn waited for the general. I assume you haven't had time to brief your XO or captain yet, Williams asked. Not yet, sir, Finn replied. You did the right thing, Williams smiled. My marine unit is on the way. They will handle it. Thank you. With that, the holoscreen went blank. Finn breathed a sigh of relief. It was his first interaction with the new general of Euphra Defense Forces. It had gone much better than he had anticipated. He hoped the marine unit could help Humphreys, as he had no way to contact the scientists now. That was all he could do for Humphreys. Now he needed to brief his XO and open the comms to him. Chapter 17, Shuttle, outside Aurora. Night had already descended around them. The shuttle journey had been slow. Part of the reason had to do with the fact that the trail left by the Rukpli vessel had been faint, which had forced his pilot at the cockpit to constantly check and make course corrections. It had tested Stanley's patience, but he realized this was the only way forward. They were now flying over a desert landscape. Stanley had checked the maps and identified this part of the continent to be known as the Stanton Desert. According to the charts, it was a vast desert that extended for many miles over 1/4 of the continent. The maps didn't allude to any cities in this region. That was good, because Stanley didn't want to attack the Rukpli vessel over any populated areas. Despite that, there still could be pockets of human settlements around. In the days after the cities had been built on Euphra, certain smaller segments of the population had wanted to live outside of the confines of the cities. Initially, the Euphra Council had denied such requests, but over time they had permitted it, considering there was still a vast area of the planet that wasn't occupied by anyone. Does anyone know if there are any settlements out here? Stanley asked. Negative, sir, the officer beside him replied. What's your name? Stanley asked, feeling strange to not know his own crew member's name. Captain, my name is Ratner, and behind me is Dalton, Ratner said. Stanley suspected both were junior officers on board his vessel. During the commissioning time of the UFS Intrepid, he had swept through the crew manifest, but truth be told, there was no way he could remember so many names of his crew. Dalton, can you send a message to Commander Mendez of our whereabouts? Stanley asked. I need him to update the Admiral. Yes, sir, Dalton replied as he opened his device and typed away at it. Soon, the news of the attack and explosion at the cave would reach UFS Central Command. He didn't want his XO nor Admiral Sheldon to think he had died during the attack. He also wasn't sure what the Euphra Defense Forces on site will report back. Transmission sent, sir, Dalton announced. Ratner turned to him. Captain, the trail has gone cold. I'm unable to pick up anything. It's just stopped in midair. Stanley peered through the viewport. The alien vessel must have landed on the surface. Bring our vessel nearer to the surface. The shuttle began to descend slowly towards the surface. Dalton pointed to the right. What's that? Stanley turned his gaze in that direction. There was a small light that stood out in the dark night. It had to be the Rukpli vessel. There could be nothing else out here for miles in any direction. Bring the shuttle down over here, Stanley directed, pointing to a location on the left. At this time of night, it was too dangerous to bring the shuttle any closer. They would need to make the rest of the journey on foot. Chapter 18, Science Division 1, Arcadia. Peters signaled to crews who slowly inched forward with him into the foyer of the building with their weapons leveled in front of them. The rest of his unit were one step behind them. He had received an alert with instructions from General Williams that there had been a possible intrusion at one of the buildings of Science Division 1. Peters and his unit had just finished helping the Euphra Defense Forces personnel at the bomb site. There were no further traces of both the Rukpli alien and its vessel. He had crews and his unit do a full scan of the area, but nothing had been detected. It seemed like the alien had disappeared. Peters was bothered by the decision of the Rukpli to choose this quadrant to trigger their bombs. Why had the Rukpli selected this location? What was so special about this set of buildings? It was only a quadrant with a civilian population. There was neither a strategic nor military significance attached to the quadrant. Was this a new tactic by the Rukpli to instill fear amongst the civilian population? If that had been the objective, the Rukpli had succeeded. He had observed many people in a traumatic state and a lot of others watching from a distance. With the magnitude of the destruction, it would be hard to keep prying eyes away from the site. Peters knew the alert had to be linked to the aliens. If not, General Williams wouldn't have sent it to him. He had gathered his unit back into the combat shuttle and they had quickly made their way to the northern quadrants of Arcadia, where the scientific community resided and engaged in most of their research work. Science Division 1 was a cluster of buildings, but the instructions had specified which building the intrusion was happening inside. As Peters followed crews into the building, he found the foyer to be empty. There was a counter at the center and two corridors leading further into the building on either side of the counter. Peters gestured to his unit and they fanned out to search the immediate space. He walked up to the counter at the foyer. Crews are standing there viewing the workstations. There's nothing here, no signs of struggle or anything. With the Rukpli, no signs of a struggle didn't mean a thing. The Rukpli aliens could have invaded the guards' bodies and destroyed them in seconds. Peters looked up at the ceiling. Can you find the video footage for this location from that device? Affirmative. Cruz nodded, bringing it up now. Cruz played the video footage. Two armed guards were observed to be seated at the counter. There was nothing unusual. Then, there was a distortion, and the two guards were gone. It was confirmed that it was the Rukpli. Peters spoke through the comms to every member of his unit. We have confirmation of the presence of one or more Rukpli aliens in this building. Proceed with caution. Then he turned to Cruz. Split the unit into two teams. You take one team down the right corridor. I'll take the other into the left corridor. Chapter 19, Stanton Desert, Euphra. Stanley peered in the direction of the light. They couldn't see it clearly from his vantage point, but they didn't need to any longer. His device had detected a faint distortion in that direction. It was the Rukpli vessel. How long will it take us to get there, Stanley asked. Probably 30 minutes, sir, Ratner replied. Both Ratner and Dalton seemed a bit nervous of what was about to happen. We need to find out what the Rukpli aliens are up to and where did they come from, Stanley said. That information is critical to knowing whether these aliens were able to bypass our orbital defenses and scans. If the Rukpli alien had been able to bypass their orbital defenses, the implication was serious. Many more Rukpli aliens could be freely roaming on Euphra. Sir, do you really think they managed to get past our scans? Dalton asked. In my opinion, I don't think so, Stanley said. Ratner, you take the lead. Stanley felt these Rukpli aliens had been here all this time on Euphra. The cave and its history supported his opinion, but that opened up other questions. Why had these Rukpli aliens decided to reveal themselves only now? Was it linked to the attack in space? Yes, sir, Ratner agreed as he led them forward. Stanley looked up at the sky as they trudged slowly over the desert landscape. The stars in the sky reminded him of images he had seen of the sky from Earth. This was probably the closest experience he would have to standing out in a desert at night back on Earth. He wondered how those on Earth would have felt if they had been standing where he was right now on Euphra. The wind began to pick up as they marched forward. 20 minutes later, Ratner stopped behind some rocks. Captain, this is as close as we can get without them detecting us. Ratner and Dalton leaned against the large rocks, which gave them ample cover from the light ahead. Stanley nodded and glanced over the rocks. The light was much brighter now. He narrowed his eyes. The alien vessel was clearly visible in the night. It had the same oval-shaped exterior as the ones they had observed in space. Both Rukpli aliens were standing outside the vessel. They appeared to be embroiled in an intense conversation. It was the first time that Stanley was witnessing two of the Rukpli aliens conversing outside of host bodies. However, the aliens looked different from the one he had encountered on UFS Intrepid. Both aliens had back-mounted weapons. The shine from those weapons alluded to their deadliness. He suspected those back-mounted weapons could automatically target and fire at them. He needed to make a mental note of it. And the hands of the Rukpli aliens didn't protrude out in a cone-shaped manner. Instead, the hands were also replaced with two sharp and long blades. The blades reminded him of the weapons he had observed in the chamber with the glass casing. Those blades would easily be able to penetrate deep into human flesh. Could this be a military arm of the Rukpli aliens? It seemed likely. That also made them much more dangerous. He stopped and sent a transmission back to his XO. It was imperative to get this news to UFS Central Command as soon as possible. He hoped his XO would have the foresight to update Admiral Sheldon. Dalton turned to him. Captain, what are your instructions? Stanley sensed the hesitation in Dalton's voice. We need to attack them and get into their vessel, Stanley announced. Whatever intelligence is on that vessel needs to be sent back to Commander Mendez. That's the priority. He didn't want to tell them that the battle ahead was going to be difficult. Those two armed Rukpli were a significant threat. It wasn't going to be easy to defeat them. The chances of the three of them staying alive wasn't that good, but they had to find a way through. The Rukpli were out here not simply waiting for time to pass by. Stanley suspected this was a rendezvous point. The Rukpli were waiting for the arrival of more of their kind. Affirmative, Dalton said. Chapter 20, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Sheldon opened a holoscreen with Lieutenant Storen. After the attack on Euphra, Storen had been reassigned back to the shipyards from the UFS Winston, and Sheldon had promoted another lieutenant to be captain of that vessel. Storen hadn't uttered a word regarding his movement. He felt Storen had been more than happy to be relieved of command and sensed that Storen, like himself, was a person who preferred to be working on the ground. Storen's face appeared on the holoscreen. Admiral, how's the progress of the container? Sheldon asked. Ever since they had identified that the Rukpli could penetrate the Trebium exterior, Sheldon, being in charge of UFS Central Command, had proposed to the Euphra Council that he needed the funds to develop a special kind of container that could be used to hold a Rukpli alien. The Council had wholeheartedly given Sheldon the green light to proceed. Sheldon found it ironic at the ease at which he was able to get the Council's approval. Previously, he would have had to debate and argue his case. But as the only admiral left in the UFS, the Euphra Council had no choice but to give in to his demands. Although he felt redeemed by it, he took no pleasure in it. There was also the added incentive that the cost of building a single container wasn't very high, and he felt the low cost helped sway the Council's votes on the matter. The pressure of being the only admiral left standing was nauseating. During his last meeting with the Euphra Council, he had also mooted the idea of identifying a pool of potential admirals quickly. The Euphra Council members had tentatively agreed with it, although a few had debated on how the selection process would be conducted. But Sheldon had sensed the civilian government was lost ever since the attack by the Rukpli and looking for answers. A few of them had asked him whether humanity could be ready to fight the Rukpli aliens. He didn't have any reassuring answers for them. The truth was that no one knew what to expect with the Rukpli aliens. Humanity was really walking in uncharted terrain. It's nearly complete, Storen replied. I'm sending you a video of the container in action. An icon appeared on his holoscreen and Sheldon clicked on it. A video footage appeared of the container. At the outset, it didn't look anything like a container. Rather, it was a small knob of tentacles that, when activated, extended out to create something in the shape of a container. The key feature was its Trebium exterior, which would in theory help contain a single Rukpli alien. Since they didn't have an exact Rukpli alien to determine the dimensions of the being, they had made an estimate. Sheldon hoped the space within the container would be sufficient for one Rukpli alien. The video footage showed the knob of tentacles extending out to create the shell for a container. In the ideal scenario, the Rukpli alien would be inside that shell. Then, they could transport the alien without any possibility of it jumping into a human host body. Once the video footage ended, Sheldon turned his attention back to Storen. I like it. Have you tested it out? We ran several tests the last few days using objects similar in size to a Rukpli, Storen replied. The only thing is that while the tentacles are closing around the Rukpli alien, we need to keep the Rukpli pinned down. Sheldon frowned. That's a separate issue. We also need to do a few more final tweaks on it, Storen remarked. Then it should be ready. Get it ready for deployment as soon as possible, Sheldon advised. With the attack on Arcadia and the map that Captain Stanley discovered in the cave, it was inevitable they were going to run into more Rukpli aliens. The only question that remained was whether they would have the fortune to capture one of the Rukpli alive. Chapter 21, Science Division 1, Arcadia. Peters inched forward, taking point as two of his unit flanked him. The alerts sent to him had indicated that Humphreys was under attack. Peters could only assume that Humphreys was someone important enough for the Rukpli to target him. However, he remained bothered by one fact. Why did the Rukpli select Humphreys? On the way to the Science Division buildings, Peters had scanned Humphreys' profile. He was the chief scientist at Science Division 1, but nothing else had been listed. Then, one of his men stopped. There was a sound. It was faint but present. It was coming from around the corner. Get down, Peters whispered as he knelt and aimed his weapon. The Rukpli alien emerged from around the corner. It hadn't realized there were humans around. Peters' eyes widened when he first set eyes on it. The Rukpli alien was different from the one they had encountered on Armstrong Station. It had back-mounted weapons, and its hands had long blades. The second the weapons fire began, the Rukpli alien leaped backwards. Move in, Peters shouted. One of his men raced ahead, firing his magwell weapon. Then a barrage of plasma fire emerged from around the corner. There was a horrible scream and a thud. Peters waited for the Rukpli alien to come rushing at them, but it didn't. Then he and his other man moved forward down the corridor. As he turned the corner, a horrific scene met his eyes. The Rukpli alien was dragging his man who had initially run around the corner using one of the long blades which had gone through his chest. There was blood everywhere. Peters fired relentlessly. However, the Rukpli alien didn't turn to face them. Instead, it kept dragging his man. Stop or we'll shoot, Peters yelled. The Rukpli alien let out a scream, and then the back-mounted weapons turned automatically towards them and unleashed its plasma fire. Peters jumped backwards and rolled away as the plasma fire stopped inches from his feet. His other man had moved towards the other corner of the corridor and was firing his magwell weapon. The plasma fire was no match for them. Fall back, Peters shouted, but his man didn't move. Did he not hear him? The back-mounted guns on the Rukpli alien turned towards the man and fired. Before Peters could move to save him, his man was consumed by fire. The sound of the back-mounted guns moving again caught his attention. Peters jumped away and retreated down the corridor. Then, he heard a door slamming and the sound of something pounding down the corridor. Peters was sweating as he glanced around. There was a room to his left. He opened it and slipped inside, closing the door. Peters whispered on the comms, "Bravo team, we have engaged the enemy. 2 men down. Need reinforcements immediately." He couldn't imagine the ferocity of the Rukpli alien. The Rukpli alien had gutted his man like it was a piece of meat and dragged him away. Just as he finished sending the message to Cruz, the door was ripped open from its hinges. The Rukpli alien was standing outside it, staring at him. The eyes on his face grew smaller and then bigger. A sneer crawled over its mouth. Peter staggered backwards until he hit the back wall of the room. Where was Cruz and the rest of his unit? It didn't matter. He wouldn't let the Rukpli alien fire at him. Peter stood his ground, raised his weapon at it, and stared back at the Rukpli alien. The back-mounted weapons on the Rukpli turned in his direction, and as it was about to fire on him, the Rukpli alien staggered backwards and collapsed on his feet. As the Rukpli alien fell onto the ground, the shape of an older man holding a small device appeared behind it. Chapter 22, Stanton Desert, Euphra. Stanley peered over the rock again. The 2 Rukpli aliens were still distracted by their own conversation. This was going to be their best chance to get to them. He glanced to his right. Dalton had positioned himself at another set of rocks on the right side of the alien vessel. Then Stanley turned to his left. Ratner had also been able to find some covering and was ready and waiting on the left. It was a risky plan, but Stanley felt it had the best chance of success. Attacking the two aliens from multiple vantage points would confuse them, at least temporarily. That would give him the opportunity to take them down. "Is everyone ready?" Stanley whispered into his comms. Both Ratner and Dalton acknowledged him. "Begin firing at them now," Stanley ordered. He got into position and waited. He hoped the two junior officers would be up to the task. When he had explained to them the plan, neither of them had questioned nor objected to it. Stanley had asked if they had any concerns, but again, there had been no response from either of the junior officers. Why hadn't the weapons fire started yet? Had the junior officers been unable to fire their weapons? Had the Rukpli aliens moved away? Stanley peered again at the Rukpli aliens. They were still in position with no idea what was about to occur. Then the first weapons fire from his left side broke through the silence of the desert. It was quickly followed by another round of weapons fire from his right side. At first, the two Rukpli aliens froze as they stopped talking and looked about. That was what Stanley had been waiting for. It was the perfect time. He aimed his weapon and fired it at the back-mounted weapons on the Rukpli alien on the left. His aim was on target as the back-mounted weapons exploded in a ball of flames. The Rukpli alien fell to the ground, trying to remove the back-mounted weapons. Stanley fired again at the second Rukpli alien, but he was too late. The second Rukpli alien had recognized the direction of his weapons fire and taken cover around its vessel. By now, the first Rukpli alien was flat on the ground and consumed by the flames. "Target your fire on the second Rukpli," Stanley directed. He couldn't see the remaining Rukpli alien clearly. It had managed to stay out of his weapons fire. "The alien's hiding at the back of the vessel," Ratner reported. "I have my sights." His words were interrupted by an explosion near him. Ratner's body was thrown in the air as the rocks he had taken cover behind was consumed by a large ball of flames. Stanley gritted his teeth. Where had that come from? It couldn't have been from the Rukpli alien hiding behind the vessel. Dalton's voice was shaky. "Ratner, are you okay?" There was no reply. Ratner was dead. "Did you see if the Rukpli fired at Ratner's position?" Stanley asked. Dalton's voice was shaky. "Negative, sir." It was then that Stanley noticed some movement from the top of the alien vessel. He squinted his eyes. There was a turret on top of the alien vessel. It was moving about in a circular manner, looking for its next target. The remaining Rukpli alien must have the ability to control the turret without physically being inside the vessel. Stanley was disappointed with himself for not picking up on the turret earlier. His failure had cost Ratner's life. "Fall back immediately," Stanley ordered. "The alien's able to control the vessel's weapons." "Captain, if we do fall back, the alien will be able to get into the vessel and then shoot us down," Dalton said. The junior officer was correct. They couldn't fall back, but they also couldn't let the turret target them. They didn't have much time to act. Something had to be done. "Move about and target the turret on the top of that vessel," Stanley highlighted. "We need to take it out." Chapter 23, Science Division 1, Arcadia. Peters stared at the older man. Who was he? What was he doing behind the Rukpli alien? The man waved at him to come out. The Rukpli alien was still on its knees, struggling with itself. Peters didn't understand what was going on, but raced out of the room and quickly moved away from the Rukpli alien. "Are you here to protect me?" the older man asked. "Are you Humphreys?" Peters asked, as he kept his eyes on the Rukpli alien and its back-mounted weapons, which for the moment didn't seem to be working. Humphreys nodded. "I saw the alien and decided to try my emitter. And it worked." Now, Peters was even more confused. What was Humphreys talking about? What did he mean by emitter? How was Humphreys controlling the Rukpli alien? "Captain, I can see you're confused," Humphreys explained. "Maybe we should move away from the alien," Peters suggested. "No, we cannot," Humphreys interjected. "I don't know how far we can be before the emitter doesn't work on the alien." Then Humphreys shared briefly with him on his experiments and how he and the chief medical officer on the UFS Intrepid had found a way to manipulate the Rukpli cells. Peters listened intensely. "Does that mean you can control the alien using the ultrasonic sound?" "I don't know all the details of how it works," Humphreys replied. "I saw you in trouble and gave it a shot. I think the ultrasonic sound weakens the alien cells somehow. That's why the alien is now struggling against itself." Peters aimed his weapon at the back-mounted weapon on the alien and was about to fire at them when Humphreys waved at him. "No, don't. If you fire, it might break my emitter signal." Peter stopped and looked at Humphreys. "We cannot wait here indefinitely. That alien will eventually be able to overcome the signal and attack us. You must have seen the blood down the corridor. It butchered 2 of my men." As he finished talking, Cruz and the rest of the unit arrived on the scene. Peters didn't understand why it had taken them so long to get over here. Peters updated her that the 2 men with him had died fighting the Rukpli alien. Cruz sent one of the other men down the corridor to check on the bodies. Cruz stood on the other side of the Rukpli alien. "Captain, that back-mounted weapon is lethal." The Rukpli alien was still trying its best to fight the emitter signal. Its head was pointed in the direction of the ground. It even appeared to be struggling to lift its head. Peters knew waiting around was not an option. "Humphreys, when I give you the signal, I want you to switch off the emitter." Humphreys looked at him nervously. "Okay." Peters motioned for his unit to surround the Rukpli alien and get their weapons ready. There was no way for them to capture this alien. They had nothing that could keep it locked up. Instead, they had to neutralize it. His remaining men and women got in position in a circle around the Rukpli alien. Then, the alien let out a scream. It was horrible but ominous. He couldn't wait any longer as he didn't know if the Rukpli alien would be able to overcome the emitter signal. "Now," Peters signaled. Humphreys nodded. Peters and his unit opened fire on the back-mounted weapon and the Rukpli alien itself. The Rukpli alien had no time to react. The back-mounted weapon exploded into a ball of flames. "Everyone, get back, but keep firing," Peters shouted as he took several steps back. Before the fire consumed the Rukpli alien, the remaining weapon's fire took it down. In a matter of moments, it was dead on the floor. "No one is to touch it," Peters stated. "Crews, get the medical unit here. Until then, get our men to secure the area around it and this floor." Crews nodded as she gathered the remaining men and women together and gave them instructions. Peters walked past Humphreys and around the corner. The charred remains of one of his men lay on the floor. The other man's blood was still drying on the floor. Peters sighed. It was his unit's first death. He had always known the time would come when his unit would suffer losses. However, he had never imagined it would be in such a horrific way. The image of his man being dragged by the blade of the Rukpli alien was something he may never forget. Crews came up to him. "Captain, Jones and Rogers were fine men." "Yes, they were," Peters said. His father, General Myers, had always warned him and his siblings of the horrors of war if they chose to serve. Death was inevitable in war, and Myers highlighted that they would have to endure the losses and continue to focus on the mission. Hearing his words then and living it now were two really different things. "Send me the details of their next of kin," Peters directed. "I will personally inform them." "The medical unit will be here shortly," Cruz said. "Let's get Humphreys and take him back to Titanic Base," Peters said. They still didn't know how many more such Rukpli aliens were roaming about Arcadia. The fact that these Rukpli aliens were armed to the teeth was alarming. Chapter 24, Stanton Desert, Euphra. Stanley eyed the Rukpli alien taking cover behind its vessel. It was clever enough to stay out of his sight. Stanley had slowly creeped over to another set of rocks to avoid the turret. The turret had kept circling around, scanning for signs of life. Initially, Stanley had been concerned that Dalton wouldn't be able to keep moving and remain out of the sights of the turret. But the junior officer had been clever in staying alive. Eventually, Stanley had come up with a simple plan. "Are you ready?" Stanley asked. "You need to concentrate all your fire on that turret." "Affirmative," Dalton said. There was no hint of nervousness in the junior officer's voice, or Dalton had become good at hiding it. "Now," Stanley said. Stanley stood, waved his weapon in the air, and then ducked again. Then he rolled away quickly from the rocks. A moment later, there was an explosion not far away from him as the turret fired at its previous position. Stanley waited as the debris from the rocks fell over him. Now it was Dalton's turn. Then the weapon's fire emerged from another direction, and it went on for a while before it stopped. Stanley got to his feet and looked up. There was smoke coming from the turret. Dalton had been able to destroy it. "Move in on the Rukpli," Stanley ordered as he slowly moved forward, firing his weapon. The Rukpli alien emerged from the other side of the vessel. "Captain, it's making a run to the hatch door of his ship," Dalton said. "Take it down," Stanley shouted as he broke into a run towards the oval-shaped alien vessel. The Rukpli alien nearly got to the edge of the entrance, but it was too late. Dalton's weapon's fire hit it on multiple locations and it went down. Stanley raced forward and kept firing, hoping it didn't get up again. By the time he reached the Rukpli alien's position, it was dead. Stanley looked at the dead body as Dalton joined him outside the alien vessel. Up close, the back-mounted weapon looked lethal. If such a military arm of Rukpli arrived on the planet in mass numbers, they would be in a lot of trouble. "That was close," Dalton said, before looking in the direction of Ratner's body. "What about?" Stanley interrupted him. "Ratner is dead. Let's move his body into this vessel." Stanley realized they didn't have time to carry Ratner's body back to their own shuttle. It would take too long, and he needed to find out any intelligence they could before more of the Rukpli aliens arrived here. Stanley found the hatch door of the vessel and pressed against the panel. Surprisingly, the hatch door responded and opened. He had expected it to be locked. However, it seemed the Rukpli aliens hadn't had time to lock down their vessel. Then he and Dalton went over to where Ratner's body lay and brought it over. Stanley tried his best not to be taken over by the smell of death that hung over Ratner's body. Fortunately, Dalton maintained his composure as they carried the body. Once they had brought Ratner's body into the alien vessel, Stanley went to the cockpit and sat down. "Captain, do you know how to fly this vessel?" Dalton asked. "Not yet," Stanley replied. The cockpit was a single long screen that spanned the entire width of the front of the alien vessel. There were multiple Rukpli symbols on either edge of the screen, but there wasn't a location from where to start the vessel's engines or even use its weapons. Stanley opened a comms link to his XO. "Mendes, I'm sending you some more Rukpli symbols. I need the translations as quickly as possible." "Affirmative," his XO replied. "How long before more Rukpli arrive?" Dalton asked nervously. The junior officer was scared, and he had every right to be. The Rukpli aliens they had killed looked like pure fighting machines with those back-mounted weapons. None of them had even muttered a word during the attack. They had been fortunate because the element of surprise had been on their side. If they had to face the Rukpli aliens directly, the outcomes could have been much different. Then a buzz rang out from the screen and a Rukpli symbol on the left edge of the screen turned red. "Captain, what's that?" Dalton asked. Stanley examined the screen. "It looks like another vessel may be approaching this area." Chapter 25, Titanic Base, Euphra. Humphreys was seated across a table in a briefing room with Peters. He looked uncomfortable, waiting for the holoscreen to come on. After the medical unit had arrived at the Science Division 1 building, Peters had brought the chief scientist back to Titanic Base for a debriefing with General Williams. No one had said a word on the journey back. His unit looked exhausted and beaten. Although they had killed the Rukpli alien and rescued Humphreys, he suspected that the loss of two of his men weighed on everyone's minds. Crews had been especially quiet as the combat shuttle had landed at Titanic Base. Peters had instructed crews to debrief the unit while he took Humphreys to a separate room. The holoscreen flickered and General Williams' image appeared. "Humphreys, this is General Williams," Peters said. "General, thank you for sending your unit to get me," Humphreys began. "I wouldn't be alive without their presence." Williams nodded. "Do you know how the aliens were able to find you?" "I'm not certain, sir," Humphreys replied, "but I can make a guess. I believe it's linked to the experiments I was running on the alien cells." Williams frowned. "What do you mean?" Humphreys then shared the details of his experiments that he had run in consultation with Chief Medical Officer Finn. "I still don't see the connection," Williams said. Peters realized Williams was slowly beginning to lose his patience. To a certain extent, Williams was like his father. Myers never liked to waste time, but always wanted to get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. "I believe when the alien cells attached itself, a trigger was created that sent some kind of signal to the Rukpli aliens here in Arcadia," Humphreys mused. "A signal?" Peters asked. "That's my best guess," Humphreys said, "like a way for them to detect their own kind. Of course, I'm not sure of this, but it would make the most sense. If not, there's no way the Rukpli aliens could have found me. There was no other reason for them to look for me at Science Division 1. Peters wasn't convinced, but he had to admit that the Rukpli had some technological way to detect Humphreys in a city of millions of people. "Can your experiment help us create a weapon?" Williams asked. "Yes, General," Humphreys agreed. "The emitter could be modified and attached to your weapons, but I need to experiment more with it. I still don't know how long it lasts and what's the extent of the damage to the Rukpli alien itself." "Understood," Williams remarked. Peters realized the dilemma that General Williams was facing. Allowing Humphreys to continue to experiment on the Rukpli was necessary, but it could also trigger more potential signals that could help the Rukpli locate the chief scientist. "Get Humphreys into one of the domes in the shipyards," Williams ordered, "and provide him with the necessary space and lab equipment that he needs to continue his experiments." "Thank you, General," Humphreys said. "If you will excuse us," Williams remarked. "Of course," Humphreys said as he stood. An armed guard opened the door and escorted the chief scientist out of the briefing room. Williams turned to Peters. "What's your assessment?" "General, his emitter is the only reason I'm still standing here," Peters admitted. "I believe we should be able to weaponize it." That was one thing Peters had no doubt about. Humphreys' innovation had saved his life from certain death. Williams smiled. "I hope Humphreys can give us more data. Until then, please locate all emitters and get them to your unit and to those at key installations in Arcadia and the Trebium mine." Chapter 26, Stanton Desert, Euphra. "Mendes, I need those translations now," Stanley ordered. "Sending them over now, sir," Mendes replied. Stanley didn't know how much time they had left before the approaching Rukpli vessel reached their position. He needed to get this vessel started and moved away from here as soon as possible. If they couldn't get out of here, there was no place to run. If they had to walk back to their own shuttle, they would be easily detected by an incoming vessel, especially when they had to carry Ratner's body. A set of information appeared on his device and he looked at them and then again at the long screen with the Rukpli symbols. Mendes had been able to translate all the symbols. Stanley was impressed. He touched one of the symbols. According to the translation that his XO had sent, it should start the engines. "I hear something," Dalton said. Stanley listened, but he didn't hear anything. Then he heard it too, a soft hum. A light streaked across the top of the long screen. Then the screen flickered on. A set of new symbols appeared on the screen. Stanley sent an image of the new set of symbols to Mendez. He hoped his XO could send back the translations quickly. I'm going to try and bring their weapons online, Stanley said as he pressed another symbol. One half of the screen split into two parts. The first part displayed the front of the vessel, while the second part highlighted the rear of the vessel. Does that mean this vessel can fire from both the front and the back? Dalton asked. The nervousness in Dalton's tone had been replaced with an excitement of being inside an alien vessel. It was only then that Stanley realized the two of them were the first humans to ever set foot inside an alien vessel. However, they didn't have the time to think too much of it. He needed to get his vessel in the air. Stanley peered at the screen. Target sign appeared on both parts of the split screen. He assumed this allowed him to target and fire the weapons. Let me try to get the vessel in the air, Stanley said. He pressed the circular symbol. The other side of the long screen was replaced with a set of virtual controls. Stanley smiled. I think we can get out of here. No, Captain, Dalton said. The tone of his voice caught Stanley off guard. He looked at the front of the screen. Another oval-shaped alien vessel had just landed 100 meters away from their one. Dalton's voice was shaky. It's too late. They're here. Just stay calm, Stanley said. Let's see what's going to happen. His heart was racing as he watched the other alien vessel. Did those aliens know something was wrong? If they did suspect anything, they wouldn't have landed in front of them. The Rukpli aliens they had killed must have been waiting for this vessel. How many such vessels were there roaming around the planet's surface? He needed to send a transmission to his XO. I cannot send a message to Commander Mendez, Stanley said. It's the same on my device, Dalton said. Captain, look, there are two of them. Something must be jamming their devices. Was it the two Rukpli aliens? Stanley returned his gaze to the front of the vessel. There were two Rukpli aliens standing outside the vessel. Both of them had the back-mounted weapons. Then they began to walk towards them. Chapter 27, Admiral's Office, UFS Central Command. You should have alerted me to Stanley's whereabouts sooner, General Williams scoffed. Sheldon realized Williams was angry, and he had every right to be. Sheldon hadn't thought of updating the general until Commander Mendez had reported that he had lost contact with Captain Stanley. It had been a mistake. That had been about 10 minutes ago. The fact of the matter was that the Euphra Council had requested both he and Williams work closely together to fight off the threat of an alien attack. It slipped my mind, Sheldon replied. That excuse wasn't going to cut it with the general. If he had been facing Myers right now, Myers would have rebuked him. Fortunately, Williams wasn't Myers. At least he hoped not. Williams softened his stance. Do you know Stanley's last position? Somewhere over the Stanton Desert, Sheldon said. He hadn't actually got the exact position from Commander Mendez. He knew he should have, but he had been distracted by the arrival of the container at UFS Central Command. That was the reason he had made the call to General Williams. However, due to the security protocols, he was unable to physically go and see the container. It had been brought to a secured location close to his office. It was frustrating that he was so close to the container but unable to view it. I'll send a shuttle over to check on his last known position, Sheldon added. Your captain could be dead, Williams admitted. He didn't believe Stanley was dead. Stanley was more than capable of surviving on his own out there. And, according to Mendez, he had a few of his officers with him. I doubt so, Sheldon defended. He had been transmitting with his XO ever since he went in pursuit of the aliens. It was still a dangerous move to go alone, Williams stated. We don't have the luxury of our captains wanting to be a hero. We only have so little of them left. If he gets out of this alive, do remind Captain Stanley of his responsibilities. He needs to follow protocol at all times. Sheldon nodded. That was probably as bad a rebuke as he was going to get from Williams. But the general was right about one thing. Stanley shouldn't have gone on his own to pursue the aliens. It was a dangerous and reckless thing to do. At the very least, Stanley should have called for reinforcements or checked in with him. Sheldon hoped that he wouldn't regret sending Stanley to investigate the cave. Williams grunted. Good. So what did you want to show me? My guys at the shipyards have created a way to hold one of the aliens, Sheldon announced. Williams raised his eyebrows. Sheldon, you got my attention. Explain. Sheldon explained the container that had been created and then played a video to show it in action. How certain are we that this container of yours can hold one of those aliens? Williams questioned. Sheldon tried his best not to show his irritation. The Trebium casing itself would be more than enough. He sounded optimistic, although the container hadn't undergone any kinds of tests as of yet, but he was sure it would work. I hope we get a chance to use it, Williams said. I do want to catch one of those Rukpli aliens. Chapter 28, Stanton Desert, Euphra. Captain, what are we going to do? Dalton asked. The fear had returned to his voice. Stanley stared ahead as the two Rukpli aliens continued to slowly walk over. The back-mounted weapon on each of them appeared to be offline. He suspected that the two Rukpli aliens had no clue anything was wrong, but that would soon change once they got closer and discovered the dead Rukpli alien. Stanley grimaced. They should have covered the dead Rukpli body, but in the chaos they had forgotten about it. He also recalled his chief medical officer's advice on not touching the dead body. Stanley pressed on another symbol. This should bring up our shields. A Rukpli phrase appeared on the screen, but there was no way for him to know what it meant. With the comms down with his XO, he hoped it meant the shields were up. Dalton pointed out, I think the shields are up. Stanley agreed. By now, the two Rukpli aliens were halfway between the two vessels. Captain, I think they've stopped, Dalton remarked. Stanley looked again at the screen. Dalton was right. The two Rukpli aliens were standing and staring at their vessel. Had the two Rukpli aliens noticed the dead body? If they had, why hadn't they started firing their weapons? Then one of them turned to the other. Were they talking with each other? Stanley couldn't tell. He prepared himself. The two Rukpli aliens turned around and began to walk quickly back to their vessel. They know, Dalton shouted. Stanley was irritated with himself. He pressed on the symbol for the weapons fire. It fired at the two Rukpli aliens, but the weapons fire missed the aliens. Stanley tried again to target properly. The controls were harder to use than he had expected. There had been no time to practice with the targeting. After the initial weapons fire, the two Rukpli aliens had begun to race back to their ship. They're nearly at their vessel, Dalton highlighted. Stanley fired again and again, but he was too late. The two Rukpli aliens had managed to get into the vessel. We need to get out of here now, Stanley said as he pressed on another symbol. The oval-shaped vessel lifted off the ground. Stanley took charge of the virtual controls and the ship began to move away from the other alien vessel. Stanley turned the ship around and pressed on a symbol which translated to thrusters. He was relieved when the alien vessel began to accelerate. Are you able to get a comms link with Commander Mendez? Stanley asked as he kept one eye on the rear view of the ship. Negative, sir, Dalton replied. It's still dead. Stanley guessed something inside the alien vessel had been activated that was jamming their devices. It could have happened after he had started the engines. If that was really the case, they wouldn't be able to inform anyone until they landed this alien vessel and got outside of it. Then a blue icon appeared on one corner of the long screen. Dalton also noticed the icon. Captain, what's that? Stanley leaned forward to examine it. There was writing below it, but it was all in the Rukpli language. Without a proper translator, it was becoming harder to fly this vessel. The Rukpli vessel is behind us, Stanley announced. And I think they're catching up with us. Are they firing on us, Dalton asked. As if to answer his question, a shudder swept their vessel. Something changed in the phrasing on the shield status. Stanley grimaced. This was worse than flying a vessel blind. He pressed on the symbol to further engage the thrusters. Their ship jumped forward. Ahead of them, a few mountains began to arise. Stanley navigated the vessel slowly away from the mountains as they raced across the planet's surface. I'm going to try firing using the rear weapon, Stanley said. He pressed on a symbol, targeted the alien vessel chasing them and fired the weapon. However, the Rukpli vessel evaded his weapons fire. He tried again, but nothing happened. They probably know we are having difficulties flying this vessel, Dalton commented. Another shudder swept through their vessel. Stanley realized they wouldn't be able to match the other Rukpli vessel on the surface. He also didn't know how long their shields would last. He pressed on the controls and their ship began to speed up into the atmosphere. Maybe getting away from the planet's surface would give them an advantage. Chapter 29. Trebium Mine outside of Thum. Peters stepped off the combat shuttle a distance from the entrance to the Trebium Mine. He had managed to get a short rest before General Williams had ordered him to get the emitters to the Trebium Mine. The first light of the new day was slowly beginning to appear over the horizon. Take care of those devices, Crew shouted. Peters glanced back. Several members of his unit were carrying a few emitters out of the combat shuttle. Based on their experience at Science Division 1, the emitters were their next best defense against the heavily armed Rukpli aliens. He had also sent 2 additional Marine units to protect the Trebium mine. If the Rukpli aliens were after the Trebium, they would certainly come here. He found it strange that the Rukpli had chosen to attack Arcadia instead of concentrating their firepower on the Trebium mine. Crews had highlighted it was because the Rukpli weren't interested in destroying the mine. That seemed to make sense. From the mysterious message Armstrong Station had received, the Rukpli aliens wanted the Trebium. No one still knew why though. What made the Trebium so special to the Rukpli aliens? Faulkner walked up to him and saluted. Captain Peters. Peters saluted back. Captain Faulkner? Yes, sir. Faulkner replied. I didn't expect your unit to arrive so early. Peters eyed the captain. His eyes revealed the man had been resting before he had been woken up. Peters wasn't surprised, but expected better from the man. Just because there was no activity out here, it didn't mean the danger was any lesser. With a deadly alien species freely roaming the planet, no place was safe. We needed to get the emitters to you as quickly as possible, Peters explained, and then shared the purpose of the devices. Until we can weaponize these emitters, the devices will have to do for now. They will be able to stop the Rukpli aliens. Faulkner nodded. I understand. Is there anything else you will need from me? Peters got the sense the man wasn't that pleased to see him and his unit. Peters had read up on the profile of Captain Faulkner on the combat shuttle. There was nothing of significance to note of the man. He had served and moved up the ranks. However, his profile had indicated that his current rank would be his highest potential as a leader. Since I came all the way here, I want to take a look at the patrols, Peters said. Of course, sir, Faulkner said. I can show you around. That won't be necessary, Peters commented. I'm sure you're busy with the schedule for the day. My unit and I will take a quick look around before heading back to Arcadia. I can send my lieutenant with you, Faulkner said. Peters agreed. Where are the additional units I sent over here yesterday? Faulkner pointed behind him. I suggested each unit spread out. One unit has set up camp to the east of the entrance to the Trebium mine, the other is on the west side. At least Faulkner had been wise in ensuring the two units were dispersed and not concentrated in a single location. But Peters still had his doubts about Faulkner. Permission to speak freely, Faulkner said. Peters nodded. I think my unit can manage the entrance to the mine without the need for the additional units, sir, Faulkner said. Peters looked at him. This was what he had feared about Faulkner. He had become complacent in his patrols of the Trebium mine. He simply didn't understand the danger the Rukpli aliens posed to humanity. Peters had to admit that Faulkner had not faced the Rukpli aliens. In fact, most of the units under his command hadn't, so they didn't have the experience of dealing with them. Faulkner was merely making an assumption based on his limited understanding of the Rukpli aliens. I understand your concerns, Peters commented. However, I just lost two of my men to the Rukpli aliens. One of them was burnt alive in front of my eyes. The other was gutted like an animal. So, you may see why I disagree with your assessment of the ground situation here. The additional units will stay in place until further notice. Faulkner didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, saluted, and made his way back to his office. Peters didn't like it. Faulkner was going to be a problem. Peters could sense the slippery slope of defiance within him. At this stage, Peters realized that he couldn't simply replace Faulkner. The timing wasn't right, especially with the Rukpli threat. Besides that, Faulkner's unit was still the most experienced at the Trebium mine, as they had been here for a few months. Peters frowned. He would have to depend on Faulkner for now. Cruz walked over to him. We distributed the emitters to Captain Faulkner's lieutenant and the other two units. That should help them fend off any attack temporarily. Peters nodded, while he continued to watch Faulkner amble back to his makeshift office and disappear into it. Chapter 30. Orbit, Euphra. Stanley eyed the long screen at the front of the Rukpli alien vessel. There had been no indication that the other alien vessel was still pursuing them. That was strange. What had happened to the other alien vessel? Had it given up on the chase? He doubted it. We're reaching orbit, Dalton announced. I'm going to take us over to the UFS Intrepid, Stanley said. We still don't have any way to communicate with them, Dalton lamented. Stanley didn't need the junior officer to remind him of it. The problem wasn't that there was no way to communicate with his destroyer. In reality, he could send a message to the UFS Intrepid, but without being able to decipher the Rukpli language, typing out the message had become an impossible task. The UFS Intrepid might attack us, Dalton said nervously. There was a chance Stanley was going to have to take. They couldn't stay in orbit indefinitely. Eventually, someone would detect their presence. He could only hope that Mendez would be able to discern it was them and not the Rukpli in this vessel. Then, an alert appeared on the screen. It was the other alien vessel. It had finally reached orbit. It was approaching them. How had that alien vessel been able to sneak up on them? Stanley looked at the translations his EXO had sent him. One particular symbol caught his eye. It had the word transportation next to it. He pressed on the symbol. The lower right part of the screen displayed a small map with a circle extending from what he assumed was the center of their alien vessel. The edges of the circle extended a considerable distance outside of their vessel. Next to the circle was another symbol which he didn't have a translation for. Dalton must have noticed the circle. Captain, what's that? It took Stanley a few seconds before he realized what he was observing on the screen. He had activated the Rukpli's advanced transport technology. The circle highlighted the area into which a Rukpli alien could transport over into. But at this current point, there was no vessel or station within the confines of that circle. Stanley was impressed with the Rukpli technology. He didn't know how it worked, but the circle represented a transport area. The other vessel is getting closer, Dalton announced. An icon appeared away from that circle. However, it was closing in on the edges of the circle. The implication was obvious. If the other alien vessel reached into the confines of their circle, the Rukpli might also have the ability to transport over into their vessel. If the Rukpli got on board this vessel, they would have to engage it. The odds were against them defeating the Rukpli aliens in such close quarters. We cannot let it reach the circle, Stanley muttered under his breath. He engaged the thrusters further as the ship accelerated in the direction of the UFS Intrepid. Chapter 31. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Mendez stared at his console. It had been an hour since he had lost contact with Captain Stanley on the planet's surface. He had informed Sheldon, but there had been no reply from the Admiral. He had ordered his sensor officer to begin scanning the surface. The only thing he knew for certain was that his captain was on board an alien vessel. There might be a way to detect the alien vessels. The thought that his captain might be dead flirted with his mind, but he pushed it aside. He had no time to worry about such an outcome. "Sir, we had detected an unknown ship in orbit," the sensor officer reported. "Put it up on the screen," Mendes ordered. An oval-shaped alien vessel appeared on the screen. It was a Rukpli alien vessel. It was moving slowly in their direction. Was Captain Stanley inside this alien vessel? Mendes couldn't be sure. "Hail them," Mendes directed. "Transmission sent," the comms officer replied. "Any reply?" Mendes asked. "Negative, sir," the comms officer said. Mendes tried to suppress a sigh. He realized that even if it was Captain Stanley, he may have no way to communicate with them. The translations to the symbols he had sent over were mainly for navigation, weapons, and the ship controls. He hadn't been asked to send any translations related to basic communication. "Sir, should we fire on them?" the tactical officer asked. "No," Mendes replied firmly. He needed more time to make a decision. If it really was Captain Stanley, he wanted to give the captain time to find a way to get to them. As long as the alien vessel didn't fire on them, there was a possibility that Captain Stanley was inside. "Sir, another vessel has appeared," the sensor officer remarked. "It's another Rukpli vessel." Mendes looked at his console. The second icon was moving towards the first alien vessel. Was this the reason that he had lost communication with Captain Stanley? Was Captain Stanley being chased by the Rukpli in the second vessel? He had to take into consideration such a scenario. "What are your instructions, sir?" the tactical officer asked. "Should we engage with them?" "How soon before we are in weapons range?" Mendes inquired. 30 seconds, the tactical officer replied. Mendes felt he didn't have anyone to ask for advice. Captain Stanley would always depend on him, but he didn't have anyone experienced amongst the bridge crew. There was also no time to check in with Admiral Sheldon. Sheldon might also not be able to provide him with the necessary advice. "The first vessel is accelerating," the sensor officer reported, "and the second vessel is increasing its pursuit." That was all Mendes needed to know. It was becoming more and more likely that Captain Stanley was in the first alien vessel. Unless both vessels were about to target and attack the UFS Intrepid. He wished he had more time to decide, but it appeared that time had run out for him. "Target our weapons on the second vessel," Mendes ordered. "Affirmative, sir," the tactical officer said. Mendes caught the sensor officer stealing a glance at him. He didn't have time to explain the rationale for his decision to the bridge crew. The two icons on his screen moved in tandem. It was definitely one vessel pursuing another. If the two vessels were attacking them, it would have been an unusual attack formation. Despite that, Mendes realized he had to be ready for any situation. So much was unknown about the Rukpli and their attack strategies. "We are in weapons range," the tactical officer announced. "Fire our slugs," Mendes ordered. He hoped the weapons fire would help Stanley get away from the second alien vessel. "Engaging, sir," the tactical officer said. In a few seconds, the slugs from the magwhale gun streaked across the view screen of the UFS Intrepid towards the second Rukpli vessel. "Has the second vessel slowed down?" Mendes asked. "Negative, sir," the tactical officer replied. "It's still in pursuit of the first vessel." "Fire at it again," Mendes ordered. Chapter 32, Orbit, Euphra. "The UFS Intrepid is firing at the alien vessel behind us," Dalton announced as he raised his fist. Stanley smiled. His exo had been able to discern that the Rukpli aliens were actually in the second vessel. Now, Stanley just needed to keep his vessel away from the vessel chasing them. It was still out of the reach of the transportation cycle. At one point, the other Rukpli vessel had nearly reached the fringe of that circle, but Stanley had been able to extract one more burst from the alien vessel's engines. That had helped increase the gap between themselves and the other vessel. However, the other Rukpli vessel wasn't giving up. Neither were they slowing down. The Rukpli aliens were persistent in catching them. It seemed that the Rukpli vessel had ignored the weapons fire from the UFS Intrepid. He also found it interesting that the Rukpli vessel hadn't yet fired back upon the UFS Intrepid. He suspected their attention was focused on his vessel. "The UFS Intrepid is firing again," Dalton said. Again, Stanley didn't know how the other Rukpli vessel was able to avoid any impact from their weapons fire. No one at UFS Central Command had still been able to come up with a viable explanation for it. Stanley realized that if they ever faced a fleet of Rukpli, they would be in significant trouble. "I'm bringing the vessel around to the hangar bay," Stanley remarked as they approached the UFS Intrepid. He hoped his exo had opened the hangar bay to allow them to land. "The other vessel is falling back," Dalton shouted. The junior officer was excited. Stanley had to give it to him. For a little while there, things had looked quite precarious, but with the UFS Intrepid providing cover, it was nearly over. As he brought the vessel around, the hangar bay was open. Stanley let out a sigh of relief. He navigated the alien vessel into the hangar bay and landed it away from the shuttles. Stanley switched off the engine. The moment he did that, the comms link became active. He had been right about the link between the alien vessel's engines and the comms link being jammed. The XO's voice crackled over the comms link. "Captain, welcome home." "It's about time," Stanley smirked as he stood up and walked towards the hatch door. He and Dalton stepped out of the alien vessel. It felt good to be back in his destroyer. Although flying the alien vessel had been an adrenaline rush, it paled in comparison to commanding the UFS Intrepid. It may have had more to do with the fact that his destroyer was his first command. "Can you get some of our people to take Ratner's body?" Stanley asked. "Yes, Captain," Dalton said. With that, Stanley stepped into a lift to head over to the bridge. They still hadn't settled the issue with the other Rukpli vessel out there. He hoped his XO was able to provide an answer for him on how to deal with that vessel. Chapter 33. Combat Shuttle, Arcadia. No more than 5 minutes after the combat shuttle had left Trebium Mine, Peters received a new alert on his device. He flipped open his device and grimaced. There were reports of new explosions at 2 different locations in Arcadia. Cruz turned to him. "Captain, what is it?" "2 more explosions in Arcadia," Peters highlighted. "How many casualties?" Cruz asked. "Unknown," Peters replied. It looked like the Rukpli aliens had decided to up their game. He glanced through the front screen of the shuttle. It was still early in the day, but most people would be moving about at this hour. Again, the Rukpli aliens had timed the explosions perfectly to maximize the casualties. The only way for them to have been able to pick the right time was through careful surveillance of the city for many months. Peters was disgusted even thinking about those Rukpli aliens watching the humans. He felt an anger rising in him, but he knew, as captain, he needed to shelf it for now. "Are these positions the same ones on the map?" Peters asked. Cruz opened the device to check. "Negative, sir." Peters frowned. He had been sent a map that Stanley and his crew had discovered in a cave outside of Aurora. The map had highlighted several locations across Arcadia. None of the locations were of high-value targets. Despite that, the initial assessment by UFS Central Command and subsequently by General Williams had been that the map was genuine, and it pinpointed potential targets. In response, Euphra Defense Forces had sent additional forces to those sites. However, it was now becoming apparent that the map could have been a decoy. He clenched his fist. "Then the map is useless," Peters admitted. His comms buzzed. It was General Williams. "Captain, by now you would have heard of the new explosions," Williams remarked. Peters was surprised that the general was speaking calmly. If it had been his father, he would have been furious at the news of more attack. "I'm heading over to one of the sites now, sir," Peters commented. He didn't want to bring up the fact that the new bomb sites weren't on the map. There was no point in debating with General Williams on the authenticity of the map. Williams nodded. "I also have a container that has been developed to hold one of these Rukpli aliens." Peters raised his eyebrows. "Has it been tested?" "That's why I need your guys to catch one of them and then deploy the container," Williams suggested. "It has a Trebium casing. I believe it should be able to hold one of them if you can corner a Rukpli alien into it." "How many do we have?" Peters asked. "Only one," Williams said. "So you need to choose wisely." Peters was skeptical about this container and its ability to hold a Rukpli alien. Having nearly lost his life to the menacing alien species, he didn't know if humanity could actually create anything to hold them. He had higher hopes on Humphrey's emitter innovation. "Have it sent to the Trebium Mine," Peters said. He predicted that would be the best place to catch one of the Rukpli aliens. Eventually, the Rukpli would come for the Trebium. Williams smiled. "That was exactly my thinking too. Good hunting, Captain. Neutralize the threat as soon as you can." Peters was still frustrated that the bombs had happened under his watch over Arcadia. He had to admit that Arcadia was a sprawling city and that there was no way for Euphra Defense Forces to effectively protect every inch of the place. Then the comms went dead. Cruz was staring at him, but Peters wasn't interested in sharing about the container with anyone, not just yet. They had more critical things to focus on. "We need to get the situation under control at the bomb site," Peters said. Comms indicated that the Rukpli alien is engaging with the Euphra security services on the ground, Cruz reported. "How many of these aliens are still around Arcadia?" Peters didn't have an answer for his lieutenant. This bomb site would be different from the last one he had been at. The Rukpli alien didn't appear to be ready to disappear. Instead, it wanted to engage with them. That bothered him. Why did the Rukpli alien want to engage with them now? The shuttle pilot turned to him. "Captain, our ETA is 1 minute. Everyone, check your weapons and armor," Peters barked. "This is the same type of alien that took out 2 of our unit at Science Division 1. Be ready to engage." Chapter 34. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "Captain on the bridge," a voice announced as Stanley stepped onto the bridge. The bridge crew and his XO turned, looked at him and saluted. Stanley acknowledged them. It's good to be back on the bridge. Back to your stations. We still have an alien vessel out there to deal with. Aye, Captain, Mendes said as he stepped aside from the captain's chair. Once Stanley was seated, he turned to his XO. You did a fine job while I was away. What's our status with that Rukpli vessel? It's still holding its position, his XO reported. I also requested for the UFS Winston to come about behind the Rukpli vessel. Stanley had to admit his XO had done a wise move in getting the other destroyer to position itself behind the Rukpli vessel. What did you find down there? His XO asked. I think the Rukpli had a group that had always been laying low on Euphra all these years, Stanley mused. They were like a remnant that had always been on Euphra waiting to ambush us. After our recent engagement with them in space, this remnant must have been activated. Nothing else made sense to Stanley. There was no way that so many vessels and Rukpli could have breached their orbital defenses. It also opened the possibility that this remnant group had been activated by another Rukpli. If so, how had the communication been done? What about the alien vessel you recovered, his XO asked. That vessel will provide us with a lot of intelligence, Stanley remarked. Can you assemble a team to study that vessel? I want every inch of that vessel combed and translated so that we know everything about this Rukpli species. I can handle the situation here. Affirmative, his XO said. I will get on it immediately. The XO stood and left the bridge. Stanley needed to find out the information as soon as they could. Hopefully, the intelligence gathered from that vessel would be able to give them a distinct advantage when the Rukpli fleet attacked Euphra. Captain, the Rukpli vessel is firing at us, the sensor officer reported. Monitor our shields and the power to it, Stanley ordered. If you notice a power drain, reverse us away from their weapons range. Affirmative, the navigation officer said. The power drain was something they still had no answer to. They didn't know how the Rukpli were able to accomplish it. In time to come, they would need to find a way to counter it. They're firing a beam at us, the sensor officer reported. Take evasive action, Stanley ordered. Aye, Captain, the tactical officer replied. Stanley felt a shudder roll through his destroyer. The beam from the Rukpli vessel had found its target. No drop in the power to the shields, the sensor officer highlighted. But our shields are at 98%. Fire our missiles, Stanley ordered. The missiles flew in the direction of the Rukpli alien vessel. The tactical officer decided to spread the missiles across a region that would make it harder for the Rukpli alien vessel to evade. Stanley observed the view screen. The Rukpli vessel is taking evasive actions, the tactical officer reported. We have a few direct hits, sir. The tactical officer wasn't able to contain the joy in his voice. It was the first time they had been able to confirm a direct hit on any Rukpli alien vessel. Stanley was hopeful. The spread of the missiles had done the trick. The Rukpli alien vessel wasn't invincible. It had weaknesses that they could exploit. The UFS Winston is hailing us, the comms officer announced. Put him on the screen, Stanley said. Captain Stanley, this is Captain Ronald, the young man announced. Ronald was one of the young lieutenants who had been promoted by Admiral Sheldon to captain. It had been out of necessity. Stanley understood the need, but wasn't sure if the young captain was up to the task. This would be Ronald's first engagement with an enemy vessel. He hoped that Ronald had read up on the previous reports about the Rukpli alien species. Stanley didn't have the time to educate the new captain on the tactics of the Rukpli. Captain, target your missiles at the rear of the Rukpli vessel, Stanley directed. My tactical officer will send you the information needed. Yes, sir, Ronald nodded. Stanley could only hope that Ronald and his crew would follow the instructions they were sending over. He didn't need them to be a hero today. He needed them to stay alive and provide a necessary distraction. The information has been sent, sir, the tactical officer said. The Rukpli vessel is firing on the UFS Winston, the sensor officer reported. Stanley had expected that. They didn't have much time left. The moment the UFS Winston fires their missiles, fire ours on a different spread to counter any evasive moves by the alien ship, Stanley ordered. The tactical officer nodded. The UFS Winston is firing now. Stanley observed the view screen. The contrails of the missiles headed out of the USS Winston towards the Rukpli vessel. Captain Ronald had executed his part of the plan. The Rukpli vessel began to take evasive actions. Then, the missiles from his destroyer raced forward. His tactical officer had done his job. Their missiles found their target. The Rukpli vessel sustained multiple hits. Captain, all our missiles are hitting them, the tactical officer said. Then the Rukpli vessel exploded into a ball of flames. There were shouts of joy amongst his bridge crew. Stanley smiled. He let his crew celebrate the small victory. However, it had taken 2 UFS destroyers to eliminate a small Rukpli vessel, which in a larger battle wouldn't be possible. And eventually the Rukpli vessel they engaged in the future would adapt to their tactics. Chapter 35, Bomb Site, Arcadia. Peters knelt and checked the body near him. It was that of a man of the Euphra security services. The body had multiple wounds. The back-mounted weapon on the Rukpli must have been the source of the wounds. He grimaced as he looked ahead. There were many more bodies strewn everywhere. Some had wounds to their heads, some were burnt badly. The plasma fire from the Rukpli's back-mounted weapon had caught these men and women by surprise. The Euphra security services shouldn't have engaged with the Rukpli. Cruz came up behind him. Captain, the weapons fire is coming ahead from that building on the left. Peters nodded as he stood. Let's go. Are there any other Euphra security services left? Cruz shook her head. Negative, sir. Whoever's left behind must be inside that building with the Rukpli alien. The medical units are on their way. There will be nothing left for the medical units to do with these dead bodies, except collect and transport them. Get 2 of our people to secure this area and keep away all civilians, Peters ordered. How far away are the additional units? ETA is 5 minutes. Peters had ordered 2 Euphra Defense Forces units from other locations to converge on this bomb site. However, 5 minutes was still too long. Everything would be over by then. We cannot wait, Peters said as he gestured to the rest of his unit to move towards the area with the weapons fire. His head-mounted display highlighted the positions of his unit as they moved in on the sound of the weapons fire. He sidestepped several more burnt bodies. As he marched forward, he realized that a large number of civilians had also been caught up in the explosion. Peters had never before witnessed such a carnage of this scale. This was unprecedented. They quickly moved towards the building and stopped at the entrance. Cruz took point and Peters followed her. The weapons fire was louder and still going on. Peters followed Cruz inside with 4 of his men and women. Inside, on the main floor, the Rukpli alien was firing its back-mounted weapon in all directions against a circle of Euphra security services personnel, each of whom had taken cover behind some metal containers. The plasma fire was relentless. As he watched one metal container exploded into a ball of flames, taking out the armed man behind it. Captain, the Rukpli is holding a hostage, Cruz announced. Peters hadn't noticed that until his lieutenant had mentioned it. Behind the Rukpli alien was a woman who was bound and on the ground. She was a civilian. That was strange. Why did the Rukpli alien need a human hostage? Didn't they have the ability to jump into the human body? Peters was confused. Something was missing with the scene in front of him, and he didn't know what it was. Surely the Rukpli alien could have jumped into the human body and escaped from here, but it hadn't. Why had it chosen to further engage with the Euphra security services? Chapter 36, Bomb Site, Arcadia. Activate the emitter, Peters whispered. Cruz motioned to one of the men who took out the emitter they had carried in with them. The man set it on the floor, positioned it towards the Rukpli alien and switched it on. The effect was immediate. The Rukpli alien staggered a bit and his back-mounted weapon stopped firing. The Rukpli alien shook its head several times. It had no idea what was going on. Everyone who isn't from my unit, get out now, Peters ordered. We'll take over from here. Help the injured outside. A few of the Euphra Security Services men hesitated. Now, Peters said firmly. All the Euphra Security Services withdrew from the building. A few of them stared at him as they left. Peters ignored their looks. He didn't have time to fight with the Euphra Security Services. Peters turned his attention back to the Rukpli alien. The woman was still on the ground. Fortunately, she hadn't made any sudden movements. She looked at him desperately, but he motioned for her to remain there. Although the ultrasonic sound was having its desired effect on the Rukpli alien, Peters didn't want the woman to take any chances. It would only take a small shift by the Rukpli alien to throw the woman against the wall of the building to her death. Peters slowly approached the Rukpli alien while his men and women formed a circle around it. The Rukpli alien was still struggling against the ultrasonic sound. It hadn't been able to determine the source of its pain. Why are you here? Peters asked, while he kept his weapon pointed at the Rukpli alien. He wasn't sure the Rukpli would be able to speak back. This is the first time anyone was trying to converse with one of the aliens outside of them occupying a human body. The Rukpli looked up at him and sneered. We are the Rukpli. It's you who do not belong here. Peters was taken back by the Rukpli alien's ability to speak. It must have had a translator embedded within his body. The Rukpli must have seen his facial expression. You look surprised that I can speak your language, but we have been watching your species for a long time. We know all about you humans. We know every one of your weaknesses. Peters stood his ground against the Rukpli alien. He realized the Rukpli alien was trying to scare them with his words. He had also instructed Cruz to keep an eye on the back-mounted weapon. If that weapon moved even an inch, he had instructed Cruz to destroy it. Why are you attacking our people? Peters asked. We didn't attack you. Trespassing on our planet is an act of war, the Rukpli scowled. But why only now? Peters inquired. He still didn't understand why these Rukpli had only decided now to reveal themselves. There had to be a reason. It wasn't a random decision. The Rukpli alien remained silent. The Rukpli gazed at the emitter. You think that can stop us? There are many more of us coming and you won't be able to stop all of us with that device. We will overwhelm and destroy every one of you. You will wish you never came to this planet. We do not mean any harm to your species, Peters said. You harm us by mining our mineral and using our planet, the Rukpli retorted. You will pay for all that. Mining our mineral? Peters didn't like the sound of that. Humanity had discovered the Trebium. There had been no species who had claimed the Trebium as their own. He still didn't understand what role the Trebium played in all of this. What do you mean? Peters asked. We discovered the Trebium. The Rukpli turned away briefly. Peters thought he was evading his question, but it appeared like the Rukpli was distracted by something. Captain, I think it's listening to our comms, Cruz whispered. The Rukpli turned back and smiled at him. It doesn't matter anymore. Our fight has already begun. You will all die on this planet. Every one of you will die. It dawned on Peter what was going on. Now he knew why the Rukpli alien hadn't escaped by jumping into the human body. He should have picked up on it the moment the Rukpli alien had decided to talk with him. The Rukpli alien was intentionally buying time. It had been sent here to distract them from something more important happening somewhere else. Peters was angry with himself for not seeing it sooner. Peters fired his weapon at the back-mounted weapon, which exploded into a ball of flames, consuming the Rukpli alien, which let out a blood-curdling scream. Cruz leaped ahead and grabbed the woman and whisked her away from the flames. As Cruz released the restraint on the woman, Peters opened her comms to Faulkner at the Trebium mine. Faulkner's shaky voice came on. Captain, we're under attack. We're under attack. We need help now. The Rukpli are here. Then the sound of weapons fire drowned out Faulkner's voice and the comms went dead. Chapter 37, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. The transportation symbol you discovered does help the Rukpli transport themselves out of their vessel, Mendes said. Mendes had just finished a preliminary investigation of the Rukpli alien vessel. It can even transport them into the middle of space as long as they have a suit on, Mendes added. Stanley eyed him. How sure are you of that? We were able to translate everything related to the transportation symbol and mechanism, Mendes replied. It's really quite advanced. That circle even indicates the exact position and climate into which a Rukpli could transport into. I've never seen anything like it. It's really beyond our comprehension. Stanley was intrigued by the Rukpli technology. Could we use it to transport humans? Mendes hesitated. I'm not sure of that. We need to study the technology they use for the actual transportation. Stanley narrowed his eyes. He had known during his conversation with Admiral Harris that UFS Central Command had been researching new ways to transport humans without the need for shuttles. If it was possible to leverage upon this Rukpli technology, then humanity would be able to achieve a breakthrough in transportation technology. He made a mental note to follow it up with Admiral Sheldon. Although Sheldon wasn't as adventurous as Harris, he felt Sheldon would be agreeable, considering the possible leap forward for the UFS. With UFS Central Command under his authority, Sheldon would most likely want to make significant contributions so as to convince the Euphra Council of his abilities. It may have something to do with the Rukpli cell structure, Mendes added. Anyway, we need to further study it. Our engineers would need to break down this vessel and find out how the transportation technology actually works. Stanley nodded. Let me discuss with Admiral Sheldon on the next steps regarding the alien vessel. I'm tempted to keep the vessel with us instead of sending it down to the shipyards for further study. He realized the shipyards would be quite busy with the construction of the destroyers and the people down there may not be able to divert their time to study the alien vessel. I heard from Finn that the chief scientist from Science Division 1 has moved his work to the shipyards, Mendes said. I hope he can find out more about the cell structure of the Rukpli. Chapter 38, Trebium Mine outside of Tum. Bring us down at the rear of the mine entrance, Peters ordered. The combat shuttle pilot nodded as he navigated the vessel in that direction. Peters had been fuming once he realized the plan the Rukpli aliens had set up. He had walked into their plan without thinking about what was actually going on. It was unacceptable. His father would be disappointed with him. His father would have been able to spot the plan. Peters had remained silent during the entire journey to the Trebium mine, and Cruz had been wise not to interrupt him. Peters had sent a transmission to update General Williams on the Rukpli strategy. Williams hadn't replied to him. He suspected Williams was also reflecting back on their mistakes. Everything the Rukpli had done on Arcadia during the past several days had been with one objective, to get to the Trebium. That had always been their target. The rest had been distractions to keep him and the Euphra defense forces busy. The map in the cave had been a planted one, which had been part of the Rukpli strategy to distract them. Peters was fortunate he had personally sent the emitters to the additional marine units at the Trebium mine. That itself would be the only thing that might save the men and women protecting the mine entrance. Williams had been right to be adamant that they protect the Trebium mine at all costs. The combat shuttle pilot turned to him. ETA in 30 seconds. Peters turns to his unit. Expect there to be multiple aliens on the ground. We need to get the aliens away from the mine entrance. Cruz nodded. She had the emitter with her. However, based on the resistance the Rukpli alien at the bomb site had faced, it appeared the emitter had its limits. As the shuttle touched the surface, Peters jumped out, followed by his men and women. A few of them were new to him. They had been last-minute replacements due to the losses his unit had suffered at Science Division 1. He hoped the new ones would be able to manage themselves. He expected a fierce fight ahead. There were loud explosions coming from the other side of the mine entrance. This section was quiet. Peters signaled ahead and his unit began to move quickly down one side of the mine towards this entrance. A few seconds later, Peters and his unit engaged the Rukpli aliens. There were 2 Rukpli standing near the entrance of the mine and firing their back-mounted weapons in all directions. The 2 Marineers he had sent as reinforcements the day before were taking the brunt of the Rukpli weapons fire. Peters didn't know how the 2 Rukpli aliens had gotten so quickly to the mine entrance. Their position at the entrance effectively blocked anyone from entering or leaving the Trebium mine. Peters turned to Cruz. Take half of the unit and try to get around them from the other side. Use the emitter when you have a clear line of sight of the Rukpli aliens. Cruz nodded and several men and women went with her. Peters gestured to the rest of his unit to follow him. He didn't know if one emitter could control 2 of the Rukpli aliens. They were going to find that out soon. Once he reached the position of one of his additional Marine units, one of the men taking cover turned to him. Captain, it's good to see your unit here. What's the status? Peters asked. The aliens appeared out of nowhere and attacked us an hour ago, the man reported. We had no warning of their appearance. Their weapons and the plasma fire are too much for us. Peters was upset. The Rukpli had taken everyone by surprise at the Trebium mine. That explained their ability to make a stand at the entrance to the mine. Where's the emitter that we passed to your unit? Peters asked. Captain Jerome took it and went towards the aliens, but they killed him and destroyed the unit before he could activate it, the man replied. Our unit has lost half of its men and women. The Rukpli had learnt of the emitters and its impact on them. Now they would target anyone with the devices to ensure they were destroyed. Peters gritted his teeth. Are these the only 2 aliens in the area? Negative, sir, the man said. We got reports from the Marine unit on the other side that there are 2 more of them. Peters realized he had been right about the Rukpli strategy. The Rukpli aliens had concentrated all their forces at the mine entrance. The other unit would also be bogged down by those 2 other Rukpli aliens. He hoped Cruz could get through with her emitter. If not, they were going to face a serious challenge. Then the sound of an engine broke his thoughts. He looked up into the sky. Take cover. Chapter 39, Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. The shadow of a vessel began to creep over the ground. Peters leaped behind some nearby rocks as the weapons fire from the vessel erupted behind them. The Rukpli aliens had brought their vessel into the attack. Peters hadn't expected that, but it also explained how the Rukpli had managed to surprise his units at the entrance to the mine. Multiple explosions rang through the air. As he peered over the rocks, bodies of men and women were thrown into the air. Peters sent out a red alert for all Euphra defense forces to converge on the Trebium mine immediately. Cruz's voice came over the comms. Captain, what was that? The Rukpli have brought a vessel, Peters said. We are taking heavy casualties. We managed to find the other unit on this side of the mine, but they are blocked by 2 other Rukpli aliens, Cruz reported. We are unable to get through. Hold your position until I say so, Peters ordered. Peters looked over the rocks. The man he had been speaking to lay dead a few meters from him. Most of his unit had managed to take cover, but the other unit had sustained further losses. Then he remembered that Faulkner had another emitter in his possession. Peters turned on the comms to Faulkner. Faulkner, this is Peters. Where are you? There was no reply. It was possible that Faulkner was also dead, and it wouldn't come as a surprise to him if the man was really dead. Then Faulkner's voice came through the comms. I'm here. Captain, you were right to bring in the additional units. I didn't think it would be this bad. Most of my men and women are dead. Peters frowned. Faulkner was a coward. He must have stayed back while his men and women got slaughtered. Peters clenched his fists, but he didn't have time to deal with Faulkner's behavior. Do you have the emitter with you? Faulkner paused for a bit. Yes, I do. What about the container that was sent over here? Peters asked. Container? Faulkner blinked. Peters was getting more frustrated with Faulkner. He didn't even know of the location of the container that could hold a Rukpli alien. As the leading captain at the Trebium mine, he should have been aware of such things. The container had to be somewhere. Peters only hoped it was outside of the mine entrance. I have a plan, but I need your help to use the emitter, Peters said. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Faulkner replied. Peters wished he could believe the captain, but he had no other choice. They needed to prevent the Rukpli aliens from gaining access to the Trebium mine entrance. He didn't know what the Rukpli aliens were specifically after here, but he felt they might want to destroy the mine, and in this way the Rukpli could prevent the humans from getting more Trebium. Peters peered over the rocks again. He didn't see any sign of this container. He also wasn't sure if he would recognize it, if he did see it. Cruz, can you see if there's a container on your side? Peters asked. It was sent over to capture a Rukpli alien. A few seconds later, an image was sent to his device. Is this it? Cruz asked. It's leaning against the wall on this side of the mine entrance. Peters examined the image. It was much smaller than he had expected. This had to be it, but he didn't know how they would operate it. In ordering the container to be moved, General Williams hadn't shared the details of how to operate it. Peters took cover and shook his head as more weapons fire roared over his head. The plasma fire from those back-mounted weapons was lethal. Williams had mentioned this container had come from the shipyard. There was one person who might know more about it. He opened a comms link to Lieutenant Storen. "Peters here." "Yes, Captain, how can I help you?" Storen asked. "I need you to tell me how to operate the container from the shipyards," Peters said. Peters explained the current situation at the Trebium mine and his objective to capture one of the Rukpli aliens. The moment Storen heard that the container might have a purpose, he became excited. It was only then that Peters discovered it was Storen and his team that had been instrumental in building the container. Peters had to calm Storen down to get the operating instructions. Storen kept fumbling in his excitement. He was surprised at how simple it was to operate the container. Then he told Faulkner, Cruz, and the combat shuttle pilot, who had landed the shuttle a distance away from the Trebium mine, what each of them needed to do. It was a plan that could easily be derailed if everyone didn't play their part. Chapter 40. Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Peters checked his device. The time was about right for the plan to be executed. The Rukpli alien vessel had withdrawn from the area. This had been in response to Cruz and the men and women on her side firing their weapons at it. Peters hoped the Rukpli alien vessel wouldn't reappear for a while. The two Rukpli aliens near the entrance hadn't stopped firing at everyone around them. Those back-mounted weapons seemed to have an endless supply of plasma fire. Peters had ensured his unit and whoever was left on this side of the mine entrance would keep the two Rukpli aliens busy. Peters gave the signal on the comms to start the plan. In a few moments, the UFS combat shuttle appeared, firing its weapons at the entrance. The two Rukpli aliens were taken aback by the shuttle. Peters smiled. That was what he had wanted. The distraction was sufficient as Faulkner activated the emitter. Peters had been worried about how reliable Faulkner was going to be. The ultrasonic sound caught the two aliens by surprise from the rear. Peters had instructed Faulkner to carefully get into position behind the Rukpli aliens before using the emitter. Initially, Peters had doubted whether Faulkner would be able to avoid detection, but Faulkner had managed to come through in the end. The two Rukpli aliens at the entrance to the Trebium mine began to stagger. The ultrasonic sound was having an effect. However, it seemed to have a stronger effect on the Rukpli alien nearer to Faulkner's position. Peters had feared it. The emitter didn't have the power to impact more than one Rukpli alien at a time. Then, he heard a few explosions from the other side of the mine entrance. Cruz had started her part in the plan. Peters stood up from behind the rocks. "Concentrate all your weapons fire on the second Rukpli alien." The members of his unit and whoever was left began firing their weapons at the Rukpli alien, who wasn't as impacted by the emitter's ultrasonic sound. The Rukpli alien tried to fire its weapons but struggled. Eventually, the Rukpli alien was taken down and its body lay sprawled at the entrance to the mine. "Captain, the two Rukpli on my end have disappeared," Cruz reported. "I don't know where they went. They might appear at the entrance to the mine." "Quickly move the container to the front of the mine entrance," Peters ordered. The other two aliens must have been picked up by their vessel. It was the most likely scenario. There wasn't much time left. He didn't know if those two Rukpli aliens would materialize at the Trebium mine entrance. He hoped not. This was going to be their only chance to capture one of the Rukpli aliens. Cruz raced out from the side and threw a mechanical device with spikes at the other Rukpli alien who was still frozen by the ultrasonic sound. The Rukpli alien didn't notice the foreign object near its feet. Cruz stood back and began using her device. Peters watched in amazement as the spikes created a casing and began to cover the Rukpli alien. It was only when the casing began to form at the alien's feet did it realize something was amiss. The Rukpli alien let out a scream, but it was too late. The emitter managed to keep the Rukpli alien under control. One of Cruz's men threw a chain around the back-mounted weapon on the Rukpli alien, and a group of them pulled against the chain. At first, nothing happened, but then slowly the small turret of the back-mounted weapon began to bend. A few more men joined the effort in pulling the chain. The Rukpli alien screamed again and tried to reach its back-mounted weapon, but it couldn't. In a matter of a few seconds, the small turret had been bent out of shape, rendering the back-mounted weapon unusable. Even if the Rukpli alien tried to use it, it would kill itself. Then, the casing quickly covered the entire Rukpli alien. Cruz raised her hand in victory as the Rukpli alien disappeared into the container. The sound of an engine interrupted Cruz's victory. Peters motioned for her to take cover. Cruz looked up into the air and began to dart into the mine. Weapons fire began targeting her, but she managed to leap into the mine and take cover. Peters motioned for his people to withdraw as the Rukpli alien vessel kept targeting anyone and everyone around the entrance to the mine. And then the weapons fire came to an abrupt halt. The Rukpli alien vessel was gone. Peters slowly walked out from behind the rocks and glanced around. There was no sound from anyone. The container was still there, with presumably the Rukpli alien trapped inside of it. The Trebium casing had prevented the captured Rukpli from getting into his vessel. Peters spoke through the comms to Cruz. "It's all clear out here. You and Faulkner can come out. We got the Rukpli." Their vessel has disappeared. He was still amazed that there was no sound coming from the Rukpli alien inside the container. Somehow the Trebium casing was having a controlling effect on the Rukpli. Cruz emerged from the entrance to the mine and walked forward, waving her weapon in her hand. Peters gave her the thumbs up. The plan had worked well, but he still didn't know where the Rukpli alien vessel had disappeared to. He sent a transmission to UFS Central Command about the missing Rukpli alien vessel. He suspected it might try to head into orbit and leave Euphra. Then Cruz was thrown back to the ground. Peters leveled his weapon and scanned the surroundings. There was nobody around. Cruz shook her head, staggered back up, and slowly inched forward. She then extended her weapon out. The moment the weapon touched something, a spark was generated. Peters couldn't believe it. A force field of some kind surrounded the Trebium mine entrance. It must have been deployed by the Rukpli. Chapter 41, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Captain, we detected that the Rukpli vessel is reaching orbit, the sensor officer reported. Ever since UFS Central Command had alerted him about the Rukpli alien vessel, Stanley had been waiting for it. Target our weapons at them, Stanley ordered. The Rukpli alien vessel wasn't going to get away, not this time. Not after it had inflicted so much damage on the planet's surface. Aye, Captain, the tactical officer said. The Rukpli alien vessel is accelerating, the sensor officer said. Stanley watched the icon on his console. It began to speed up. What was it doing? What was going on? Fire at will, Stanley barked. I'm unable to target it, sir, the tactical officer remarked. Launching missiles now. The missiles sped forward towards the Rukpli alien vessel. They weren't in time. One moment the Rukpli alien vessel was there, and the next moment it was gone. The icon had vanished from Stanley's console. Where'd it go? His XO asked. Scanning the area, the sensor officer said. Stanley frowned. How had the Rukpli alien vessel disappeared from their view so quickly? It's gone, sir, the sensor officer reported. I scanned this region of space. I'm unable to detect it. Stanley frowned. He slammed his fist on the chair. They had lost the Rukpli alien vessel. The Rukpli vessel hadn't even waited to engage them. I think their vessels are equipped with an advanced technology that lets them travel fast, his XO mused. If his XO's theory was true, then this would be one more challenge that they would have to counter when they next met the Rukpli. Chapter 42, Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Peters sat down in the combat shuttle and opened a hollow screen with General Williams. Prior to this, he had tried to see if there was a weakness in the force field around the entrance of the mine. They had covered every inch of it, but hadn't discovered any such weakness as of yet. Lieutenant Cruz wasn't the only one trapped inside the force field. In addition to Faulkner, another man from Peters' unit had followed Cruz inside before the Rukpli had enacted the force field. Faulkner hadn't taken the reality of the situation well. He had tried to throw rocks at the force field. Every rock had bounced off the force field as if it was nothing. Peters had soon realized that the force field was jamming their communication devices. They weren't able to communicate with Cruz or anyone through the usual channels. Instead, Peters had resorted to writing a message and showing the device to Cruz. Although primitive, the new means of communication had led to Faulkner taking a step back and calming himself down. Meanwhile, Cruz had remained calm. Peters knew she could handle the current situation. She was fortunate to have one more of his men in there with her. However, Peters didn't know how long Faulkner would remain calm. Faulkner was an unknown variable in the equation. After Peters had updated General Williams on the situation at the Trebium mine, he had brought Admiral Sheldon and Captain Stanley online. Peters had been forced to repeat everything again. Sheldon looked skeptical. Are you sure there's no way to penetrate the force field? So far, we haven't found a way, sir, Peters replied. But we're working on it. Can't we blast through it, Sheldon asked. Any blast to the force field could cause an explosion which may result in the mine entrance caving in, Williams said. It was a naive question by the UFS admiral. His lack of combat experience was clearly revealed by his stance. But Williams seemed to be patient with Sheldon. The Rukpli may even want us to blast our way through, Williams added. Then the Rukpli really have us, Sheldon scowled. This was what they were after, Stanley said, shaking his head in dismay. We all walked into their trap. The map was useless. Everything was a setup to get to the mine. It seems so, Peters agreed. There's something else I need to update you on, Stanley said. Lieutenant Diaz on board Armstrong Station managed to locate the source of the transmission that they received before the disappearance of Admiral Harris and the commanders. It came from the other end of the Vonia system. It could be a possible planet or even an outpost, but it's confirmed as the position from which the transmission originated. What are you proposing, Sheldon asked. I'm proposing I take a group of vessels to investigate the origin of the transmission, Stanley said. We need to strike back without waiting for the next Rukpli wave. Peters nodded. I agree with Stanley. Waiting for the Rukpli is no longer an option. The Rukpli we encountered this round are merciless killers. They will stop at nothing until they get what they want. General, what are your thoughts? Sheldon asked. Peters realized that Sheldon was scared of approving such a mission to the fringe of the Vonia system. He suspected that was why Stanley had brought it up in front of all of them. If Stanley had asked Sheldon privately, it may have been shut down. I think it's a good idea, William said. We have sustained many casualties. We must strike back. Stanley, draw up your plans and propose it to me and Sheldon. We'll then seek advice from the Euphra Council and get their approval for the mission. Thank you, Stanley said. Stanley, as a new captain, was being much more than Sheldon could ever be. Those were the kind of people Euphra needed right now. What about the Rukpli prisoner? Peters asked. Send it back to UFS Central Command, Williams directed. I'll get my men to figure out a way to interrogate it. Peters nodded, but he wasn't sure the Rukpli in the container would be open to any form of interrogation. But he knew they had to try. Chapter 43. Unknown location, fringe of one-year system. A male Rukpli turned to his counterparts seated next to him. Our team on planet C-126 are on the way back. The other older male Rukpli stared ahead at the vastness of space. They accomplished their mission. Any casualties, Troyan? Troyan nodded. Yes, Commander, we lost a few of ours down there. This human species is more persistent than we had anticipated. What else? The humans also managed to capture one of our crew, Troyan said. The older male Rukpli whipped his cone-shaped hands in front of him in anger. It wrapped itself on the table in front of him and made a screeching sound. How did we let that happen? The human species has learned how to use the mineral against us, Troyan replied. This disgusting human species thinks it can defeat us, the older male scowled. They have no idea of the power of the Rukpli. We will exterminate them like we have done other species. Troyan hesitated. I also got a report that the humans have lined their vessels with the mineral. They're doing it rapidly for their other vessels. But we have stopped them from mining the mineral with our force field, right? The older male asked. Yes, Commander. It should slow down their use of the mineral, Troyan said. The older male grunted. But I'm fascinated by the humans, Troyan said. There are a few of them who are able to counter our defenses. The older male Rukpli shook his head. It doesn't matter what these humans can or cannot do. Their time is coming to an end. What about the seed? It has been planted into one of their lieutenants, Troyan sneered. It's waiting for our instructions. Excellent, the older male Rukpli smiled. Ensure the seed stays quiet until the right time. Now that phase 2 of our attack on this human species has been completed, I'll check with our supreme leader on the next steps. The end.